Welcome to my channel. In my channel, you can watch various type of fiction and fantasy audiobook. If you want more video like this, please subscribe my channel.
Avatar. There is a stubborn rock in the north. Part 1. The canyon was like a hideous wound hacked into the earth by a giant axe, exposing jagged rock walls of ochre and rust that silently squeezed the winding caravan below. The sound of wheels grinding over gravel was monotonous and hollow. In this immense silence, it was amplified several times over, echoing back and forth against the steep cliffs before being swallowed. Sunlight squeezed sparingly into this narrow crevice, casting a blinding pillar of light only briefly at noon. Now, however, it slanted westward, stretching distorted, deep shadows across the valley floor. The air was thick with the dry, choking scent of dust mixed with the warm musk of the pack animals. Rock-strong Stone walked beside his father, Panchi Jonshuo. He deliberately stepped heavily, making the sound of his boots on the gravel clearly audible. The 12-year-old boy already had a tall, straight posture, dressed in the Panchi family's signature green and white martial attire. His black hair was slightly mussed by the canyon wind, but his brown eyes held a steadiness beyond his years, though at this moment, that steadiness was stirred by a visible layer of confusion and resentment. Why? He finally couldn't help but ask. His voice wasn't loud, but it was exceptionally clear in the silent canyon. This trade mission, why did you have to bring me along? He subconsciously raised a hand, his fingertips touching the hard object pressed against his chest, that cold, sharply outlined platinum flying bore metal. It pressed into his flesh like an unignorable brand. Panchi Jonshuo stopped in his tracks. The head of the Panchi family was as thick and imposing as a mountain, his weather-beaten face sharply chiseled, yet now he wore a trace of a helpless smile. His broad, heavy hand landed on Shi Jian's shoulder, the force carrying the characteristic solidity of the Panchi family. Shi Jian, his voice was deep and resonant, echoing in the canyon, that metal on your chest, do you truly not understand its weight? Shi Jian remained silent, his fingers unconsciously curling tight as the hard edges of the metal dug deeper into his palm. The Baifeng family is a giant tree standing side by side with us, the Panchi. Their roots run deep. Panchi Jonshuo's gaze turned toward the dark end of the canyon ahead, as if trying to peer through the rock walls toward the distant Baifeng family territory. By uniting with the Baifeng family's only pearl, the roots of Panchi and Northern entwine tighter, drawing enough strength to support a new sky. This is the foundation of our family. Panchi and Northern, it has been so for generations. He paused, looking down at his son's stubborn profile, his tone softening further. Besides, that child. Toph. Shi Jian uttered the name gloomily. A blurred shadow flickered in his memory, a blind girl who always sat silently in the corner of the Baifeng family's vast courtyard, watching the mud or stones. Their few brief meetings, separated by the polite chatter of elders and deliberate arrangements, were as estranged as if they were separated by a cold stone wall. The number of times we've met can be counted on one hand. We aren't close. He was stating a cold, unpleasant fact. The smile vanished from Panchi Jonshuo's face, replaced by a deep gravity that Shi Jian couldn't fully comprehend. His rough fingers gently brushed the wind-blown hair from Shi Jian's forehead with a rare, almost clumsy tenderness. This was also your mother's dying wish. These words were soft, yet they hit Shi Jian's heart like a massive boulder, instantly shattering all his youthful resistance, leaving only a heavy, unspeakable bitterness spreading through his chest. His father's voice continued, carrying a weight that tried to be soothing but remained heavy. The days ahead are long, Shi Jian. The road is still far. You will get to know each other. Father. Shi Jian wanted to say more, but his throat felt blocked. The blurred but warm memories of his mother and his resistance to this unknown, forced future crashed violently within him. He lowered his head, his gaze falling on the sand crushed by the wagon wheels. In that frozen moment of silence, above the deathly quiet canyon, a scream that tore through the air erupted without warning. The sound came from overhead, from the tops of the dizzyingly steep cliffs on both sides. Shi Jian snapped his head up, his pupils suddenly contracting. The sky was set ablaze. It wasn't the sunset, but countless blazing fireballs trailing hideous plumes of smoke. Like a meteor shower from hell, carrying a violent will to destroy everything, they tore through the narrow strip of gray-blue sky above the canyon. They whistled and spun, bringing a suffocating heat as they smashed down toward the winding caravan that looked like a line of ants at the bottom of the valley. Time seemed to be gripped and stretched by an invisible hand. Every expression on Panchi Jonshuo's face froze instantly, replaced by a volcanic fury and resolve that Shi Jian had never seen before. He was no longer the father who was usually as steady as a mountain, but a lion thoroughly enraged, wanting to tear everything apart. Enemy attack. A thunderous roar erupted from Panchi Jianshuo's throat, instantly drowning out the whistling of the fireballs and making the cliff walls on both sides tremble. Earthbending. Protect. The command was concise and violent, containing the most primal power of the Panchi bloodline. The Panchi guards, men as taciturn as the rocks on the family crest, reacted with startling speed. There was no fear on their faces, only a near-numb instinct trained into their very marrow. Almost the moment Panchi Jianshuo's shout left his mouth, a dozen figures lunged like lightning toward the heavy freight wagons at the core of the caravan. Roars and the muffled sounds of rapidly churning stones mingled together. Ha! Rise! The solid earth seemed to take on a life of its own under their shouts. The hard ground of the valley floor trembled and groaned violently as massive, earthy yellow rock walls, like the backs of giant beasts, crashed upward from the ground. They were coarse and heavy, carrying the primal scent of soil, instantly merging and stacking above and beside the caravan to form a massive, rough stone dome, attempting to shelter the entire group within. This was the ultimate defense of orthodox Panchi earthbending, immovable as a mountain. Boom, boom, rumble. The first wave of fireballs had already struck. The violent explosions sounded like war drums beaten by gods, detonating densely across the hastily formed stone roof overhead. Rock fragments mixed with burning soil and wood chips poured down like a rainstorm. The entire canyon shook frantically. The scorching shockwaves slammed into the stone dome with dull, terrifying thuds. The roof swayed violently as large chunks of rock were shattered and peeled away by the violent fire, falling like a landslide. Through the cracks, searing air and thick smoke poured in frantically, carrying the scent of sulfur and death, instantly making it impossible to breathe. Screams, the terrified neighing of pack animals, and the crackling of burning goods, instantly tore the silence of the canyon into a hellish dirge. Hold steady. Panchi Jianshuo's roar rose through the gaps in the explosions like a stabilizing pillar. His massive frame burst forth with startling speed, grabbing Shi Jian, who was still in shock and reeling from the blasts, and yanking him violently behind his back. Shi Jian slammed into his father's iron-hard back, feeling an irresistible force shielding him completely. Through the gaps of his father's broad shoulders and the cracks in the crumbling stone dome, Shi Jian saw a sight he would never forget. Several fireballs broke through the defense, smashing into the pack animals and guards on the perimeter. Flesh and blood turned into burning charcoal in an instant, even the screams were cut short after half a cry. The flames greedily licked at everything flammable, thick smoke billowed, and the smell of charred meat mixed with the scent of blood, so pungent it was nauseating. He recognized the man who had been hit head-on by a fireball and instantly turned into a torch. It was the guard uncle who had smilingly handed him a piece of dry rations that morning. Fear, a cold, immense fear he had never experienced, pierced Shi Jian's heart like a serpent's fangs, seizing his breath. It's the Fire Nation. Those sons of fools. A guard captain's eyes were bloodshot, his face covered in the splattered blood and ash of his comrades. He roared, his hands plunging into the violently shaking ground before he yanked them upward. A boulder the size of a carriage was torn from the valley floor and, carrying all his strength and fury, whistled as it was hurled toward several red figures barely visible on the cliffside. However, the enemy was faster and more lethal. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The sharp sound of air being sliced was even more shrill than the whistling fireballs. Dozens of crimson fire lines came not from above, but from the natural caves and protruding rock platforms on the cliffs, like the eye sockets of devils. These were fire arrows unique to Fire Nation elites, launched by heavy crossbows at speeds exceeding the limits of the human eye. They were terrifyingly precise, like crimson vipers, darting through the cracks and gaps in the stone dome to bite down. Thud, thud, squelch. Dull, tooth-aching sounds of penetration rang out one after another. The Panchi guards, Earth Kingdom warriors known for their defense, found the thin earth shields they hastily gathered before them to be light paper against the close-range, high-speed volley of fire arrows. The arrows easily tore through rock and flesh, bringing forth sprays of hot blood. Shi Jian watched as the guard captain who had just hurled the boulder suddenly stiffened, 3 crimson fire arrows protruding from his chest. The flames attached to the arrows instantly ignited his clothes and hair. He opened his mouth as if to roar again, but only spat out a mouthful of smoke laced with sparks before falling straight back, his heavy body kicking up a cloud of dust. No! A beast-like roar erupted from Shi Jian's throat, and a violent power exploded uncontrollably from within him. Anger, fear, and the intense pain of witnessing his clansmen's tragic deaths broke through the dam of his reason like lava. He lunged a step forward from behind his father, his hands instinctively thrusting forward. Die! The ground beneath his feet surged frantically. Several sharp, spear-like, twisted stone spikes burst from the earth, carrying his uncontrolled violence as they stabbed haphazardly toward the cliffs. However, the distance was too great. Though the power was fierce, it was scattered and disorganized. The stone spikes crumbled from exhaustion before they even reached the cliffs, falling futilely as a pile of rubble and only kicking up more dust. This reckless attack instantly exposed his position. Shi Jian, get back! Panshi Jianshuo's heart nearly burst with terror, his roar filled with unprecedented panic. His massive palm shot out like lightning, clamping onto Shi Jian's neck like an iron pincer, and he yanked him back with immense force. Almost at that very same instant, SSH, a specialized fire arrow, burning with a blinding white flame and featuring a strange spiral pattern on its tail, whistled through the air. With terrifying precision, it pierced through a wooden crate on the wagon right behind where Shi Jian had just been standing. The arrowhead buried itself deep, leaving only the white flame at the tail vibrating violently. The temperature of that flame was horrifyingly high, instantly turning the surrounding wood into charcoal. It was an assassination. The target was clear, the heir of the Panshi family. Shi Jian was yanked into a stumble by his father's immense strength, falling to the ground. His forehead slammed hard against the cold gravel, and warm blood flowed down his brow, blurring his vision. He looked back in terror at that horrific, still burning arrow, the chill of death instantly froze his very bones. Panshi Jianshuo's eyes were instantly bloodshot, red as gore. It was no longer anger, but a completely ignited, suicidal madness. His son had nearly been assassinated right before his eyes. He took a violent step forward, his burly frame like a catapult loaded with 10,000 catties of force. The rocks beneath his feet groaned and shattered under the unbearable weight. He clenched his fists, the knotted muscles on his arms bulging to the extreme, blue veins popping out beneath his skin as if they were about to burst through. Fire Nation scum! His roar shook the canyon, causing gravel to cascade down, carrying a world-destroying fury. Taste the wrath of Panshi, earth. Quake. Mountain. Collapse. Rumble. The earth was no longer just trembling, it let out a pained, destructive roar. With Panshi Jianshuo's footing as the center, the ground within dozens of yards ahead was violently crushed and overturned as if by an invisible giant hand. Huge chunks of rock, some as small as millstones, others as large as entire houses, were torn from the depths of the crust by a force of ultimate violence. Carrying the kinetic energy to destroy everything, they hurtled like a meteor shower, blotting out the sky as they smashed toward the cliff walls where the fire arrows had come from. The air was compressed, letting out dull explosions. This was the desperate, life-risking strike of the Panshi family head. It was the peak swan song of the Panshi family's earthbending power. Boom, boom, rumble. The rocks collided violently with the cliff walls. The mountains crumbled and the earth split. Rubble poured down like torrential rain. Screams echoed from the cliffs as several Fire Nation soldiers who couldn't dodge in time were instantly crushed into pulp or ground by rolling boulders, leaving only streaks of jarring crimson. This strike temporarily suppressed the lethal fire arrows on the cliffs, but it also completely exhausted Panshi Jianshuo's strength. His burly frame swayed, his face turned deathly pale, and a trickle of bright red blood leaked from the corner of his mouth. He looked as if his spine had been removed. Father! Shi Jian struggled to his feet and rushed over to support him. Go! Panshi Jianshuo's voice was as raspy as sandpaper, thick with the scent of blood. He shoved Shi Jian's hand away, his gaze as resolute as iron. Take the young master, and go. This command was roared at the few remaining Panshi guards who had gathered around, covered in blood. However, it was already too late. Above them, the rocky ceiling, which had endured too many impacts and was already teetering, collapsed with a jarring, massive cracking sound. An even greater disaster descended. It wasn't just the fragments of the rocky ceiling that collapsed, but also the cliff walls on both sides that had been loosened by Panshi Jianshuo's desperate strike. Dozens of tons of massive rocks, like prehistoric beasts breaking their chains, poured down and smashed toward the remaining members of the Panshi family at the bottom of the valley with the force of 1,000 thunderbolts. The world seemed to have been put in slow motion. Shi Jian only saw his father spin around. On that face covered in blood and soot, yet still as resolute as a mountain, all the madness, anger, and pain had vanished, leaving only a nearly frozen, ultimate depth of tenderness and reluctance. Those bloodshot brown eyes, which had once struck terror into his enemies, now clearly reflected Shi Jian's terrified face. Time was too short, so short that Panshi Jianshuo only had time to make one movement. Using the last of his life's strength, he spread his arms like a giant eagle protecting its chick and lunged toward Shi Jian. His massive frame erupted with incredible speed, instantly covering Shi Jian completely beneath him. With his mountain broad back, he built the final barrier of flesh and blood. Dad! Shi Jian's shrill cry was drowned out by the horrific roar of the falling boulders. Bang! The first massive, jagged rock struck Panchi Jianshuo's back with the force of 1,000 catties. The terrifying crack of splintering bone was as clear as if it had exploded in Shi Jian's ear. His father's body buckled downward, pressing heavily upon him, and a mouthful of scalding hot blood, mixed with bits of internal organs, sprayed out, drenching Shi Jian's face and neck. That blood was shockingly hot. Then, a second, a third, more boulders crashed down. Like the hammers of a giant god, they mercilessly struck that burly frame which had already lost the ability to resist. Shi Jian was pinned to the cold ground by his father's heavy body, unable to move. His vision was completely obscured by his father's blood-stained clothes and the shadows of the boulders constantly falling and rolling above. Every horrific vibration from the crashing rocks was transmitted clearly to him through his father's broken body, each bringing a wave of suffocating pain and the nausea of churning internal organs. His father's body continued to deform and collapse under the heavy strikes of the boulders, the sound of splintering bones like a demon's chewing, gnawing at Shi Jian's soul with every hit. The warm, viscous liquid with a heavy metallic scent, his father's blood, soaked through his clothes and seeped into the soil beneath him, bathing his entire being in a thick crimson. Dad! Dad! He cried out in vain, his voice shattered. With every breath, he inhaled thick smoke, dust, and that nauseating scent of blood. The massive roar of falling rocks was like an endless death knell, rupturing his eardrums and leaving them ringing. His consciousness continued to sink and blur amidst the intense pain, suffocation, and ultimate terror. He didn't know how much time had passed. Perhaps it was only a few breaths, perhaps as long as a century. The falling boulders seemed to have temporarily stopped. But the canyon did not regain its peace. Instead, another sound arose, a dense, cold noise of clashing metal and heavy boots stepping over gravel, closing in from all directions. Like a pack of wolves on the hunt, they approached with undisguised murderous intent. The Fire Nation soldiers were coming down to clear the battlefield. Just then, the heavy, lifeless body pressing down on Shi Jian seemed to twitch ever so slightly, like a spasm. Shi Jian's unfocused, blood-crusted eyes suddenly widened. A large hand, drenched in blood with broken and deformed knuckles, groped with agonizing slowness and a heartbreaking persistence. Finally, it found Shi Jian's hand, which was clutching the flying pig badge. With a final, faint trace of strength that was almost imperceptible, those cold, stiff fingers stubbornly pressed the platinum flying boar medal, stained with the blood of both father and son, its edges already deformed from being squeezed, deep into Shi Jian's tightly clenched fist. The cold metallic touch of the badge and the last bit of warmth remaining on his father's fingers formed a cruel contrast. Having completed its final mission, that large hand lost all strength and fell limply, hitting the pool of blood beside Shi Jian with a heavy thud and splashing a small amount of viscous gore. Mother, wait, for me. Shi Jian. An extremely faint, shattered breath, like a flickering candle in the wind mixed with the gurgling of welling blood, squeezed out with difficulty against Shi Jian's ear. Every word seemed to be wrenched from broken lungs, carrying the last embers of life in an unspeakable concern. Then, everything fell into a deathly silence. His father Panchi Jianshuo's body completely became a cold, heavy mountain of flesh and blood pressing down on Shi Jian. That final thread holding Shi Jian's sanity together snapped. Ah! An indescribable, violent power, a mixture of overwhelming grief, heavenly hatred, and total collapse, erupted uncontrollably and destructively from the deepest part of Shi Jian's young body like a bursting volcano's lava. This was not conscious earthbending, but an instinctive backlash from a soul being torn apart. Boom! With Shi Jian as the center, the ground within several yards violently arched and exploded. Countless sharp stone pillars and shattered rock fragments sprayed out in all directions like an out-of-control fountain, carrying mud and blood. Several boulders that had landed on his father's remains were violently tossed aside and flung away by this uncontrolled power. The powerful shockwave even sent several Fire Nation soldiers, who were about to approach and investigate, staggering back in horror. But this power instantly drained Shi Jian's last bit of vitality. After the eruption came total darkness. The last sight he saw was his father's face right before him, covered in blood and dust, and the gray sky above, cut into fragments by boulders and smoke. His consciousness was like a kite with a snapped string, rapidly falling into a cold, boundless abyss. His hand, which had been clutching the badge, went limp, leaving only that blood-stained platinum flying pig stubbornly wedged between his bloody fingers, reflecting a faint and cold metallic luster in the dim light. Dash dash dash. The news of the Panchi family caravan's destruction spread north along the trade routes at top speed, like a plague carrying the scent of blood. When this tragic news pierced the Grand Baifeng family residence like an icicle, the entire family felt as if they had been cast into an ice cellar. Inside the council hall, the core members of the Baifeng family sat around the heavy red sandalwood table, their expressions as solemn as iron. A stifling silence filled the air, broken only by the occasional crackle of wood burning in the fireplace, which sounded like it was striking everyone's tense heartstrings. The Panchi family is all gone. An elder's voice was dry and raspy, trembling with disbelief. Panchi Jianshuo and his wife, and 137 people in the caravan, including the most elite guards of the Panchi family, none survived. The steward in charge of intelligence kept his head low, his voice as heavy as lead. The scene was too horrific to witness. The Fire Nation's methods were clean and efficient, they were aiming for total extermination. He paused, then added with difficulty, the canyon was almost completely filled by falling rocks. At the end of the long table sat the head of the Baifeng family, Bei Hong, as steady as a mountain. He was tall with a resolute face, but at this moment, he seemed to have aged 10 years in an instant. His hands on the table were clenched into fists, his knuckles white and trembling slightly. His gaze was fixed on the small, warm green jade amulet on the table before him. It was the engagement token sent by the Panchi family years ago, a pair with the flying pig on Shi Jian's chest. The hard edges of the jade were nearly crushed by the power of his palm. What about the boy, Shi Jian? Bei Hong's voice was terrifyingly low, every word sounding as if it were ground out from deep within his throat. The steward shook his head with difficulty. The search team, for now, has found no trace of the young master. Given that destruction, the possibility of surviving. He didn't finish, but the meaning was clear. Find him. Bei Hong slammed the table, the heavy surface letting out an unbearable groan. He stood up abruptly like an enraged lion, his eyes bloodshot as he scanned everyone in the hall, his voice resolute and carrying the unquestionable authority of the family head. If he's alive, I want to see him. If he's dead, bring his bones back to me. Dig. Turn the entire Rift Valley over. Mobilize every hand we can. What the Baifeng family owes the Panchi is more than just business. His bloodshot gaze finally landed on a silent figure below, the old steward of the Baifeng family, the trusted confidant who had accompanied the Panchi matriarch before her marriage, an old man with white hair and a face etched with the furrows of time. The old man's back was straight as a rod, and a nearly frantic obsession burned in his cloudy old eyes. Ah Fu, Bei Hong's voice carried a heavy entrustment, you lead the team personally. Yes, master. The old butler Ah Fu's voice didn't hesitate for a moment, carrying a strength as firm as a rock that even overcame the raspiness in his throat. He bowed deeply, his age-spotted hands pressed tightly to his chest, where the gentle smile of the former young mistress, Madame Panchi, seemed to linger from the day of her wedding. Blood must be paid in blood, but at this moment, finding the young master of the Panchi family, even if there was only a glimmer of hope, was the only consolation for the deceased. The search order was like a stone cast into a stagnant pond, instantly stirring the dormant power of the behemoth that was the Baifeng family. In less than an hour, a massive search party consisting of the Baifeng family's most elite guards, experienced miners, and several keen-sensing earthbenders had assembled before Bei Hong. Heavy digging tools, sturdy ropes, and simple stretchers filled the courtyard. Frost was frozen on everyone's faces, and their eyes burned with the flames of revenge and a stubborn persistence for a slim hope. Bei Hong personally escorted Ah Fu to the main gate. He pressed a family token symbolizing supreme authority heavily into the old man's hand, his voice low like muffled thunder, at all costs, Ah Fu. The honor of the Baifeng family and the blood feud of the Panchi family both rest on this. This old servant understands. Ah Fu gripped the token as if holding a weight of 1,000 pounds. He took one last look toward a certain direction deep within the main residence, toward the young mistress's room, then turned resolutely, barking an order with a hoarse throat. Move out. The team was like a silent torrent, galloping south in the twilight. The heavy sound of horse hooves shattered the silence along the way, leaving only rolling clouds of dust behind. The scene at the Rift Valley was even more tragic and inhumane than the intelligence reports had described. When the team led by Ah Fu arrived, it was already the morning 2 days later. The once hideous entrance to the rift was almost completely sealed by collapsed boulders, forming a new mountain of rubble that exuded the stench of death. The air was thick with a nauseating smell of char, blood, and rotting corpses, mixed with dust so heavy it made it hard to breathe. The charred remains of freight wagons were like giant black skeletons scattered among the rubble. Congealed dark red blood splattered shocking patterns across the grayish-white rocks. Broken limbs, crushed by boulders or charred by fire, could be seen everywhere, attracting swarms of scavenging crows that let out shrill cries. Even the battle-hardened guards of the Baifeng family couldn't help but turn pale, their stomachs churning at the sight of this living hell. Dig. Ah Fu's voice sounded like rubbing rusted iron plates, yet it carried an unquestionable resolve. His bloodshot eyes stared fixedly at the massive pile of rubble, as if trying to pierce through the heavy rocks to see that slim hope. Everyone. Dig it out inch by inch for me. Every single stone must be turned over. Watch for any sign of life, anything, belonging to the Panchi family. The order was given, like opening the gates of hell. Heavy pickaxes and steel crowbars struck the rocks violently, making ear-piercing clangs. Strong arms strained to pry up thousand-pound boulders, and ropes creaked on pulleys. The earthbenders of the Earth Kingdom stood in relatively stable areas, their hands steadily manipulating the power of the earth, carefully guiding the upper layers of giant rocks to move slowly to avoid triggering secondary collapses. Dust rose again, mixing with the lingering smell of gunpowder and death. Time passed amidst heavy pounding and coarse breathing. 1 hour, 2 hours. The relentless noon sun scorched this valley of death. Sweat soaked everyone's clothes, mixing with dust to leave muddy furrows on their faces. Hope was like a drop of water under the scorching sun, rapidly evaporating. Uncle Fu. A young miner's voice carried a sob and despair. Down there, it's too deep, it's impossible. Shut up. Ah Fu interrupted him sharply, his aging body erupting with a terrifying aura. He snatched a pickaxe and lunged at a giant rock himself, his vein-popping arms swinging and smashing down frantically. The pickaxe struck the rock, creating blinding sparks. Dig. Keep digging for me. As long as there's one stone left unturned, you are not allowed to stop. His roar was hoarse, carrying an almost insane obsession. The young mistress's only flesh and blood, the sole survivor entrusted by the master of the Panchi family and the young mistress, he could not give up. Never. Just as despair was about to submerge everyone like a cold tide. A petite figure appeared at the edge of the rubble pile at some unknown time. She was barefoot, stepping on the scorching, sharp fragments of stone as if she felt nothing. Her grayish-green eyes looked vacantly at the massive stone tomb ahead, her small brow furrowed tightly. It was Toph Baifeng. No one knew how she had followed them, and no one noticed when she had arrived. She was like a silent breeze appearing at the edge of this purgatory. Miss Toph. The captain of the guards exclaimed, hurriedly stepping forward to stop her from approaching this dangerous place. But Toph only lightly raised a hand, signaling him to be silent. She walked slowly, step by step, toward the core area of the rubble being painstakingly cleared. With every step she took, her bare soles made extremely slight, almost imperceptible contact with the rocks and earth. The surrounding noise, the clanging of iron, the heavy breathing, the shouted commands, all seemed to drift away from her. Her world was reduced to the tiniest tremors and pulsations coming from deep within the earth beneath her feet. She walked very slowly, as if fumbling in the dark. Her vacant grayish-green eyes had no focus, but her entire mind was concentrated on the flood of information transmitted from the small space beneath her feet. The coldness and weight of the rocks, the looseness and bloodiness of the soil, the stiffness and silence of the remains, countless chaotic, fragmented images, representing death flooded into her perception. Suddenly, she stopped beside a slanted giant rock. This stone was exceptionally heavy, one of the main beams of the collapsed ceiling. The guards were currently trying to move it with ropes and levers. Toph's toes curled slightly, and her small nostrils flared gently. She slowly crouched down and placed one palm lightly and steadily onto a nearby stone slab that was relatively flat but soaked with blood stains. Time seemed to freeze. The surrounding guards and miners stopped their movements, holding their breath as they watched the blind young lady. Ah Fu also stopped his frantic digging, his cloudy old eyes staring fixedly at Toph's hand on his face covered in blood and sweat. Toph's palm felt the coldness and roughness of the stone slab, and the thick blood that had long since dried and seeped into the cracks. Her brow furrowed even tighter, as if she were trying hard to distinguish some extremely faint, extremely distant sound. Her perception pierced through the thick rock and soil, through the silence of death, and deep within that chaotic layer of earth, she struggled to capture a trace of an almost negligible, extremely slow and weak pulse. Like a seed buried deep underground, about to exhaust its last spark of life. Here. Toph's voice was very light, carrying an unquestionable certainty that broke the heavy silence. Her vacant gaze pierced through layers of rock, locking onto a certain point deeper and darker beneath the stone slab. Underneath, something is moving, very slow, very weak. Ah Fu's body jolted, and a terrifying glint instantly erupted in his eyes. He practically lunged over, roaring, "Quick! Dig here! Be careful! Miss Toph says there's movement below." No one knew how Toph had come or how a blind girl could determine the location, but Ah Fu didn't hesitate for a second to order the search. The spark of hope was instantly ignited. Fatigue and despair were dispelled, and all strength was concentrated on this area. The earthbenders manipulated even more carefully, guiding the surrounding rubble and soil to flow to both sides. Strong arms used crowbars against the edge of the stone slab, prying with all their might to the rhythm of their chants. 1, 2, 3, lift. The heavy stone slab was pried up and moved inch by inch. What was revealed beneath was a deeper crevice filled with blood, mud, and rubble, and the silhouette of another, even more tightly pressed giant rock. Further down, Toph's voice rang out again, her finger pointing toward the small, dark triangular area formed between the giant rock and the bedrock below. In that crack, there's something warm. Warm. The guard captain was taken aback. It's body heat. Ah Fu understood instantly and roared, it's a living person. Quick, clear the rubble next to it. Be careful not to let anything fall in. Tools were probed into the crevice more carefully, clearing the blocking rubble and congealed blood mud bit by bit. Every movement tugged at everyone's hearts. Toph remained half-crouched to the side, her palm pressed against the adjacent rock like the most precise detector, guiding the direction and force of the excavation. Slower, there's a sharp stone on the left, the right side is loose, she instructed in a low voice, her vacant vision seemingly piercing through the obstacles to clearly see the complex structure below. Finally, after clearing the last few pieces of rubble, a faint beam of light struggled to penetrate that narrow triangular space. A guard holding a torch suddenly thrust the firelight into the crevice. The beam of light dispelled the thick darkness, instantly illuminating the scene deep within the crack. That scene made everyone who saw it, including the most cold-blooded guards, gasp. Their stomachs cramped, and their eyes instantly grew stinging and wet. A boy's body was completely buried in blood, mud, and rock fragments, almost unrecognizable as human. He was curled up, shielded tightly beneath a tall, burly, yet long since crushed out of shape by boulders and mangled, massive body. That body was like a small mountain, its back completely caved in and limbs twisted, having borne all the weight and impact from above to stubbornly carve out a tiny survival space for the boy beneath it during the cataclysm. The boy's face was completely covered in blood, dust, and dried scabs, making his features almost indistinguishable. His eyes were tightly shut, and his breath was as weak as a flickering candle in the wind. The only thing that could prove his identity was the fragments of his blood-soaked, almost dark brown-green and white martial arts uniform. And the most striking thing was one of his hands, covered in blood, mud, and spread out weakly. Between the fingers of that hand, a metal badge was tightly wedged. It was also covered in foul blood, yet it still reflected a faint and cold luster, a platinum flying pig, clumsy in design but with clear lines. Young master. Ah Fu let out a heart-wrenching wail, tears streaming down his old face. He scrambled to the opening of the crevice, his trembling hand reaching in but not daring to touch, for fear that the faint breath would cease right then and there. Quick! A stretcher. The softest stretcher. Water. Clean cloth. A physician. Call a physician here quickly. He roared incoherently, his voice broken and shattered. The guards used the fastest speed and the gentlest movements to carefully clear the last bit of rubble and mud from the boy's body, avoiding any secondary injury. Working together, they extremely slowly moved the massive remains, protecting him just a little bit, revealing the boy's bruised and purple body. When the boy was carefully lifted out of that narrow crack of death and placed onto the stretcher covered with thick, soft cloth, everyone saw the extremely faint rise and fall of his chest. He was still alive. Inside the fortress built of his father's flesh and blood, at the center of the purgatory that had wiped out his clan, Shi Jian miraculously retained a trace of breath. Go home. Ah Fu knelt by the stretcher, his calloused and blood-stained hand extremely gently and tremblingly brushing away the matted hair clotted with blood from the boy's forehead. Muddy tears fell in large drops onto the cold rock. Miss Toph, he's found. We're taking Little Stone home. Toph still stood quietly to the side. She couldn't see the tragic scene on the stretcher, but through the soles of her feet, she clearly felt the vibration of that weak life being lifted from the place of death. The thick scent of blood and sadness permeating the air hit her like a physical tide. Her vacant grayish-green eyes moved slightly, and her small lips were pressed tight. For the first time, she clearly felt something called heaviness weighing on her young heart. This fiancé she had never been familiar with had broken into her world of perception in such a tragic way. The search party didn't dare delay for a moment. They secured Shi Jian to the stretcher with the fastest speed, and the most capable guards took turns carrying it as if holding a fragile, rare treasure, quickly evacuating this valley of death. Ah Fu didn't leave the side of the stretcher for a single step, his bloodshot eyes staring fixedly at Shi Jian's paper-pale face, his mouth constantly murmuring, "Hold on. Little Stone, hold on, we're going home. Young mistress. Master, protect him." The team disappeared silently and quickly at the end of the mountain path, leaving only that mountain of rubble soaked in blood and shrouded in sadness. Under the pale noon sun, it told a silent tale of tragedy and undying hatred. That warm green jade amulet was currently gripped tightly in Bei Hong's hand, piercingly cold. And its other half, that blood-stained platinum flying pig, was accompanying its dying master on the unknown and difficult road to rebirth toward the Baifeng family. Several days later, the morning sun, carrying the unique crispness of the north, filtered through the window lattices covered in plain white Korean paper, gently spilling onto Shi Jian's face. The light wasn't dazzling, yet it felt like a fine needle, softly piercing through the heavy darkness of his sinking consciousness. He struggled to open his eyes. His vision was a blur at first, as if separated by a thick mist. The light bloomed before his eyes, forming irregular spots. Then, the scenery began to coalesce into outlines, extremely slowly and with great difficulty. Unfamiliar roof beams, unfamiliar curtains, and unfamiliar air carrying a faint scent of medicinal herbs mixed with agarwood. Beneath him was a soft, thick silk mattress, and the thin quilt covering him featured delicate embroidery. Everything was worlds apart from the cold hell of his memories, which was filled with gunpowder, blood, rubble, and his father's heavy body. A powerful sense of unreality seized him. Immediately following that was a surging wave of intense pain. The bones throughout his body felt as if they had been repeatedly crushed by giant boulders and then crudely pieced back together. Every tiny breath pulled at a tearing agony in his chest and abdomen. His throat was so dry it felt like it was smoking, burning with fire. His forehead, arms, legs, wherever they were wrapped in bandages, a dull, swelling pain and itchiness radiated from them. Ah! An unconscious groan of pain escaped from his cracked lips, so weak it was almost inaudible. But this minute sound was like a pebble thrown into a calm lake, startling another person in the room. You're awake. A cool, calm voice, carrying a hint of a young girl's characteristic youthfulness yet being exceptionally direct, rang out not far from the bedside. There was no surprise, no concern, and not even much emotional fluctuation, it was simply stating an observed fact. Shi Jian turned his stiff neck with difficulty, looking toward the direction of the voice. Sitting on a low couch by the window was a girl. She was wearing the high-quality light green martial attire characteristic of the Baifeng family, with simple black cloud patterns bordering the cuffs and collar. Her feet were bare, resting casually on the smooth teak floor. Her long black hair was tied up. Her face still had obvious baby fat, with a pert nose and a small mouth. She should have looked naive and adorable. However, those eyes. They were a pair of hollow, unfocused gray-green eyes. They were as clear as the water beneath a northern ice lake, yet they reflected none of the sunlight from outside the window, nor could they see Shi Jian's current pathetic state. They simply gazed forward quietly, as if looking through the walls at some distant, unknown point that only she could perceive. Toph Baifeng. This name was like a cold symbol, instantly crashing into Shi Jian's chaotic consciousness. The blurred girl in his memory, silently, looking at the soil in the corner of a vast courtyard. The exchanged tokens, his father's entrustment, and those heavy words spoken by his father before the overwhelming disaster. The days ahead are long, you will get to know each other. Immense grief and the hatred of his family's extermination, like a dormant beast, were instantly awakened by this unexpected encounter, savagely biting at his heart. His throat tightened suddenly as a metallic sweetness welled up, only to be forced back down. He instinctively wanted to prop himself up to flee this unfamiliar environment, to flee this imposed, blood-stained connection. Hiss. The violent movement pulled at the wounds all over his body, the pain making his vision go dark. His body twitched uncontrollably, and he fell heavily back onto the pillow with a dull thud. Cold sweat instantly soaked the stray hairs on his forehead. Toph, by the window, seemed completely unaffected by his painful struggle. She merely tilted her head slightly, her small ears twitching almost imperceptibly, as if catching the groan of pain and the minute vibration of his body hitting the soft pillow. Her hollow gaze still didn't focus on Shi Jian, but her perception, like invisible threads, had already firmly locked onto the agonizing living being on the bed. Don't move. Her voice remained calm and waveless, yet it carried an indisputable tone. Many of your bones were broken, they've just been set. She paused, her small nose wrinkling slightly as if distinguishing finer components in the air. Grandpa AFU watched over you for 3 days and was just persuaded to go rest. The physician said that since you were able to wake up, your life is tough enough. Tough enough. These words hit Shi Jian's heart like cold stones. Yes, his life was tough enough. His parents had used their flesh and blood to shield him from falling rocks, and the 137 lives of the Panchi family had paved his narrow chance for survival. This toughness was soaked in the blood of his closest kin. He closed his eyes, biting his lower lip hard until he tasted the rusty flavor of blood. His chest heaved violently, each breath carrying a suppressed, broken sob. His clenched fists, with nails digging deep into his palms, brought a sharp sting, but it was not even a 10,000th of the pain in his heart. Just then, he felt something cold and hard pressing against his palm within his clenched fist. He snapped his eyes open and looked at his right hand. His knuckles were white from the force of his grip, and between his fingers, a platinum badge stained with dark brown smudges, its edges even slightly deformed, was stubbornly reflecting the cold morning light. It was that clumsily shaped flying pig. The thing his father had shoved into his hand at the very end. The thing his father, before dying, had used his last strength to give him, the token of the marriage contract, with the girl before him. An indescribable, complex emotion mixed with grief, indignation, humiliation, and resistance churned within his chest like lava. This badge now seemed to carry his father's scalding blood and cold dying words, turning into a heavy shackle, a bloody brand. No. A raspy low growl squeezed out from deep in his throat, filled with pain and resistance. As if burned by the cold metal, or as if trying to throw off a heavy burden, he swung his hand violently, wanting to hurl the badge away. However, his body, weakened by severe injuries, simply couldn't muster the strength. His arm only lifted weakly for a moment before the badge slipped from his hand, tracing a faint arc in the air. With a light ding, it fell onto the smooth floor not far from the bed. It rolled a few times in the morning light before finally stopping, its platinum pig nose stubbornly facing the bed, and Toph by the window. Shi Jian panted rapidly, staring fixedly at the glaring badge on the floor as if looking at an ominous curse. The room fell into a brief, deathly silence. Toph's hollow gaze still didn't focus on the fallen badge. But her toes curled ever so slightly as her bare feet stood firmly on the cool floor. The crisp sound of metal hitting the ground was clearly transmitted to her feet, and then through her bones and nerves, it sketched a clear trajectory in her unique world of perception, flying from the bedside, rolling on the floor, and the exact position where it finally stopped. She slowly stood up from the low couch, her movements silent and agile. Barefoot, she walked step by step toward where the badge had fallen. Every step was incredibly steady, as if the floor beneath her wasn't smooth wood, but the solid earth she was so familiar with. She stopped before the badge and crouched down. Without groping or hesitation, her slender hand, still possessing a child's roundness, pressed down with unerring precision directly onto the cold platinum flying pig and picked it up. Her fingertips felt the cold touch of the badge, along with the faint residual body heat and sweat belonging to Shi Jian. Deeper still, she seemed to be able to touch the scent of blood on the badge, blood that had long since dried but could never be erased, belonging to the Panchi family, and to the uncle Panchi she had never met. Toph stood up, holding the badge, and turned toward Shi Jian's bed. Her hollow gray-green eyes looked at him. Although she could see nothing, Shi Jian felt an invisible, heavy gaze fall upon him. She didn't speak. She simply placed that flying pig badge, stained with blood and dust, gently yet with an undeniable firmness back onto Shi Jian's pillow. The cold metal touched his cheek, making him shudder slightly. Your thing. Toph's voice was as calm as ever, as if stating the most ordinary of facts. Uncle Panchi gave it to you. Having said that, she didn't linger. She turned around and left the room as silently as she had come, her bare feet making no sound. The door was gently closed, shutting out the morning light and the suffocating silence she had left behind. Shi Jian lay there stiffly, the cold badge by his pillow feeling like a red-hot iron searing his nerves. Toph's final sentence was like a cold key, instantly unlocking the memories he had tried so hard to seal away. A silent roar exploded in the depths of his soul. Immense grief and overwhelming hatred, like an out-of-control flood, instantly smashed through all his defenses. Before his eyes was no longer a warm room, but a collapsing canyon, a burning caravan, his father's body crushed by boulders, and the scalding blood spraying onto his face. Ah! A violent, chaotic power full of destructive intent erupted uncontrollably from within him. It wasn't conscious earthbending, but the most instinctive venting of a soul being torn apart. Boom! With Shi Jian's body as the center, the ground beneath the bed shook violently. The solid teak floorboards let out a tooth-aching groan, instantly arching upward and cracking. Countless tiny pieces of rubble and dust shot out from the gaps like a fountain. The heavy bed was violently tossed up on one side by this out-of-control force before falling back down with a dull, massive thud. The medicine bowl on the nightstand shattered to pieces with a loud clatter. Dust filled the air. Shi Jian began to cough violently, each cough pulling at the wounds all over his body, making him curl up in pain. Following the explosion was total exhaustion, cold sweat soaked his clothes, and his vision swam with darkness. He gasped for air like a dying fish, while the cold flying pig badge by his pillow continued to emit a faint, stubborn glow amidst the diffusing dust. Outside the door, hurried footsteps approached from afar, accompanied by Grandpa Afu's panicked cries, "Young master! Young master, what happened to you?" Further away at the corridor's corner, Toph, who had just left, stopped in her tracks. Her bare feet stood firmly on the floor where the vibrations had just settled. Her hollow gray-green eyes shifted slightly, and her small brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. She had clearly felt the trajectory of that power eruption, chaotic, violent, and filled with a destructive sorrow, like the roar of a trapped beast at death's door. This fiancé, who had been forced upon her, seemed to carry more than just a blood feud. His power itself was like a volcano that could erupt at any moment. Afu pushed open the door, panting, his clouded old eyes instantly stung by the sight before him. The room was filled with choking dust and the strong smell of medicine. The morning sun passed through the dancing dust, sketching a heartbreaking silhouette. That solid teak bed now looked as if it had been torn by the claws of a giant beast. One side of the bed's legs had sunk deep into the floor, while the other was propped high, causing the entire bed to take on a distorted tilt. The thick silk quilt had slid to the floor, revealing the curled, trembling figure of the boy beneath. Shi Jian. He was like a young beast ravaged by a storm, curled on the tilted bed boards, his body spasming violently from coughing and pain. Cold sweat soaked his thin inner garment, clinging to his gaunt back and outlining the bony shape beneath the bandages. Fresh cold sweat on his forehead mixed with undried blood, snaking down his pale cheeks and dripping onto the equally stained pillow. He bit his lower lip hard, fresh blood seeping from between his teeth, while broken sobs were suppressed deep in his throat, every intake of breath carrying a tearing agony. Most glaring of all was that stained, deformed platinum flying pig badge by his pillow. It lay there quietly, its cold metallic luster reflecting the boy's deathly pale face like a cruel mockery, an inescapable bloody brand. And what made Afu's pupils shrink even more was the floor. The solid teak floor, centered around where Shi Jian lay, had actually split into several hideous cracks. It was as if the earth had been torn apart by an invisible force. Splintered wood and tiny sandstones had burst from the cracks, scattering everywhere. Near the bed, one could even see the gray-black solid soil layer beneath. A scorching residual aura from the rampage of a violent power still lingered in the air, mixed with dust and the scent of blood. The nightstand lay toppled to the side, the precious medicine bowl long since shattered into pieces, and the dark brown medicinal juice was splashed across the cracked floor and walls, leaving behind striking stains. Young master. Afu let out a heart-wrenching wail, stumbling toward the bedside. His hands, covered in calluses and the marks of time, reached out trembling, wanting to touch Shi Jian, only to stop abruptly just before contact, fearing his rough palms would bring more pain. He looked at the boy's spasming body, at the bloodied badge, and at this room that looked like a disaster scene. Old tears instantly burst from his eyes. My goodness. Oh, my goodness. He spoke incoherently, his voice choked and broken. How was this a quiet room for recovery? This was clearly a cruel reenactment of the Canyon tragedy within the Baifeng family's estate. The young master's body was enduring intense pain, and his soul was being repeatedly torn and tortured by that overwhelming blood feud and inescapable heavy shackle. Physician. Quickly, call the physician. Afu turned his head sharply, shouting at the other servants who had come running at the sound, his voice sharp and distorted from extreme heartache. His clouded tears fell in large drops onto the cold, cracked floor. Quickly. The young master is unwell again. The servants were also stunned by the sight, and only upon hearing Afu's roar did they snap out of it, hurriedly turning and sprinting away. Another few days passed. Afu had left on the pretext of managing the Panchi family's affairs. Although the Panchi family had suffered a heavy blow, leaving only Shi Jian as its sole survivor, the family's foundations and influence within the Earth Kingdom were still not to be underestimated. Shi Jian sat on a cold stone bench in a pavilion like a forgotten stone sculpture in a corner of the courtyard. His gaze hollowly pierced through the meticulously trimmed shrubs ahead, yet all he saw was the dust of the collapsing canyon and his father's blood-stained face. The cold touch of the Panchi badge seemed still branded into his palm, that weight and humiliation almost crushed him. Grandpa Afu's departure had caused his last bit of familiar support to vanish, leaving only this vast, exquisite, yet utterly foreign northern estate, and that blind girl who had been forced upon him. Footsteps, as light as treading on fallen leaves yet exceptionally clear, approached. It wasn't Afu's worried, slightly heavy stride, but one with a peculiar rhythm, each step landing firmly on the ground as if resonating with the earth itself. Hey, mute stone. A cold, direct voice rang out, carrying the crispness unique to a young girl but lacking any warmth of greeting. Toph's figure appeared at the entrance of the pavilion, her light green martial attire making her look like a fresh bamboo shoot in early spring. Her hollow, gray-green eyes looked in Shi Jian's direction, or rather, looked at the point where his body vibrated the air and the ground. Shi Jian's body stiffened almost imperceptibly. He didn't respond, nor did he even turn his eyes. He only wanted to bury himself deeper into the cold stone bench, isolating himself from this suffocating reality. Toph seemed completely indifferent to his silence. She walked straight into the pavilion, her bare feet stepping on the polished stone slabs with a faint rustling sound. She stopped in front of Shi Jian, so close that he could smell the faint scent of earth and the cold, crisp aroma of vegetation on her. Those hollow eyes, clearly unable to see, nonetheless made him feel as if he were being scrutinized by some invisible force. What's the point of sitting here day after day? Toph's tone wasn't a question, but a statement, carrying a hint of imperceptible disdain. Or perhaps, it was a lack of understanding for doing nothing. She reached out with a hand that possessed the roundness of a child's but contained startling power, accurately grasping Shi Jian's bandaged wrist hanging by his side. Shi Jian jolted violently. As if burned by a branding iron, he instinctively tried to pull his hand back. Toph's fingers, however, were like iron bands, not applying great force, but exceptionally steady, firmly locking onto his wrist bone. That cold touch and unquestionable strength instantly ignited his suppressed anger and humiliation. Let go. He growled, his voice hoarse and dry, carrying suppressed rage. His body instinctively resisted this sudden, forceful touch. He tried to shake her off, but the movement pulled at his unhealed wounds. A surge of sharp pain hit him, causing him to suck in a breath of cold air, and his movements faltered. I won't, Toph replied succinctly, her brow furrowing slightly as if she felt a hint of impatience at his violent reaction. Instead of letting go, she used the force of his struggle to give him a sharp tug. Come on, let's find something to do and have some fun. Fun. Shi Jian squeezed those words out from between his teeth, filled with intense irony and unbelievable grief. The blood of the Panchi family was not yet cold, his parents' remains were barely settled, he was heavily injured with an uncertain future, imprisoned in this strange cage, and forced to accept this absurd engagement, and this woman actually spoke to him of having some fun. A massive sense of absurdity and offended rage erupted like magma. He exerted sudden force, ignoring the sharp pain, and violently threw off Toph's hand. Simultaneously, a chaotic, violent power surged uncontrollably from beneath his feet. Boom! The stone floor of the pavilion shook violently. With Shi Jian's position as the center, spiderweb-like cracks instantly spread out. A few smaller stone slabs even tilted upward and shattered. The pavilion's pillars groaned under the strain, and a few wisps of dust trickled down. Shi Jian staggered back a step, clutching his aching chest and breathing heavily, his face turning even paler from the pain and anger. He glared at Toph, his eyes filled with rejection, agony, and the desperate glint of a cornered beast. Toph had lightly slid back half a step the moment he threw her hand off, her bare feet planted firmly on the vibrating ground like a reef amidst waves. Her hollow gray-green eyes looked at the mess on the ground at Shi Jian's feet, then raised her head to look toward his heaving chest. There was no panic, no accusation. She simply tilted her head slightly, her small ears twitching as if carefully discerning the remaining fluctuations of that violent power in the air and the vibrations caused by Shi Jian's heavy breathing. Then, on her face still carrying a hint of baby fat, she let out an expressionless, "Oh. Decent strength," she commented calmly, as if evaluating the hardness of a rock, but terrible control. A waste of effort. She stepped forward again, ignoring the fire burning in Shi Jian's eyes and the shattered ground beneath his feet. She reached out once more, her target clear as she grabbed his arm, this time avoiding the bandages on his wrist and grabbing his upper arm directly. Don't be like a bristling porcupine. Toph's voice remained flat, but it seemed to hold a hint of command. Follow me. Sitting still will only let your bones rust and your brain rot. She paused for a moment and added with a tone of natural certainty, it hurts less when you're moving. Her fingers possessed a strange, irresistible force that neither hurt his wounds nor allowed him to break free. Shi Jian was pulled into a stumble, forced to leave the cold stone bench that had seemed like his final fortress. Where are we going? Shi Jian growled as he struggled, his voice full of resistance and a subtle sense of helplessness born from weakness. He was half dragged, half pulled by Toph out of the pavilion, heading toward an unknown direction deep within the courtyard. The gravel underfoot rubbed against his cloth shoes, every step felt like treading on thorns. Toph didn't look back, her bare feet treading steadily on the bluestone path. Her voice drifted through the cool morning air, clear and direct. You'll know when we get there. Shi Jian was half dragged, half pulled away from the pavilion by Toph towards the depths of the courtyard. Every step felt like treading on red-hot coals. The dull ache of his wounds mixed with the burning rage of being offended scorched his nerves. He tried to break free, but Toph's seemingly slender hand was like iron shackles, firmly clamping his upper arm. Her strength precisely avoided the bandaged wounds yet left him unable to budge an inch. This sense of power formed a sharp contrast with her youthful face and baby fat, adding another layer of humiliation. Let me go. Shi Jian squeezed the words through his teeth, his voice a suppressed rasp. I don't need your help. It's not up to you. Toph's voice came from ahead, calm and steady, her pace never faltering. She walked barefoot on the bluestone path, each step incredibly firm, making a faint but clear rustling sound that seemed to tread on Shi Jian's anxious heartstrings. You're the only survivor of the Panchi family now, and the trouble my father forced on me. If you work yourself to death, Grandpa AFU will cry his eyes out, Uncle Panchi's coffin lid won't stay down, and my father will feel disgraced. Trouble. Her words were like cold stones, hitting Shi Jian's heart one by one. They stirred up more than just ripples, they were a towering wave of fury. He was the only survivor of the Panchi family. A trouble that needed to be watched, pitied, and even disdained. His father's sacrifice, the destruction of the Panchi family, she spoke of it all so lightly. Shut up. Shi Jian suddenly erupted with a low roar. All his strength surged recklessly toward the arm Toph was holding, attempting to throw her off with brute force. Simultaneously, the earth beneath his feet seemed to sense his frantic state of mind, emitting a dull hum. However, just as that chaotic power was about to burst from his body and tear the ground apart again, Toph's wrist gave an extremely subtle flick. A strange force, as soft as a ripple yet incredibly resilient, traveled from her fingertips into Shi Jian's arm and spread throughout his entire body. It didn't feel like a head-on collision, but rather an exquisite guidance and neutralization. The brute force Shi Jian had gathered for the explosion felt like hitting a mass of invisible, dense cotton. It was instantly drained, dispersed, and vanished into nothingness. The humming of the earth stopped abruptly, as if smoothed over by an invisible hand. Shi Jian felt his arm go numb, his gathered strength was easily dismantled. His body lost balance due to the overexertion, and he stumbled forward uncontrollably for 2 steps, nearly falling. He looked up in shock at the back of the figure still walking steadily ahead. She hadn't even looked back. Through that tiny contact alone, she had precisely sensed and neutralized his rampaging power. Like I said, terrible control. Toph's voice remained flat, as if commenting on an insignificant action. Using strength without hitting the right spot is no different from a wild boar ramming a tree. Shi Jian's face instantly turned from a flushed red of anger to a pale white of shame. The Panchi power he was so proud of, the strength he had used to fight alongside his father during the family's destruction, was so lightly dismantled by this blind girl and compared to a wild boar. Extreme humiliation drowned his anger. He clenched his teeth, no longer trying to break free or speak. He was like a puppet that had lost its strings, allowing Toph to drag him through the exquisite corridors and around the rockeries and ponds. Every step was incredibly heavy, the grief and indignation in his heart intertwined with his current sense of helplessness, nearly suffocating him. Finally, Toph stopped. A scent mixed with dust, sweat, and a certain metallic tang hit him. The sounds of dull impacts, shouts, and the clanging of metal against rock reached his ears. Shi Jian looked up, and a small private training ground came into view. We're here. Toph let go of his arm, her bare feet stepping casually on the coarse gravel at the edge of the training ground, seemingly unfazed. Her hollow gaze swept across the noisy training ground and precisely locked onto an area in the center, where several hard basalt pillars, each requiring 2 people to encircle them, stood. Watch closely, mute stone. Toph's voice wasn't loud, but it clearly pierced through the noise of the training ground into Shi Jian's ears. It also seemed to catch the attention of several disciples training nearby. They slowed their movements, their gazes carrying curiosity and a hint of imperceptible awe as they looked toward the petite figure at the edge of the field. Toph ignored those gazes. She took a slight breath, her body relaxing as her bare feet rooted firmly into the gravel. Then, she moved. There was no run-up, no exaggerated power-gathering pose. Her body merely sank slightly, as if merging with the earth beneath her feet. Then, her right fist, that hand with a child's roundness that looked completely non-threatening, shot forward with a speed so fast it almost left an afterimage, in a plain and ordinary strike. The movement was minimalist to the extreme, without any flashiness. Thud. A low thud, so deep it made one's heart skip a beat. The sound didn't resemble metal clashing or a giant rock splitting, it was more like an invisible giant hammer slamming into the heart deep within the earth. The entire training ground floor shook violently. Shi Jian, standing closest, felt the gravel beneath his feet jumping. Shi Jian's gaze was fixed on the basalt pillar that had been struck. On the surface of the pillar, with Toph's knuckles as the center, a circle of clearly visible ripples of cracks spread out silently and extremely rapidly. The cracks weren't chaotic, they formed a perfect, progressive concentric circle. Wherever the cracks passed, the hard basalt looked as if it had been melted by high heat and then instantly cooled, showing a strange, dense crystalline luster. There were no flying stone chips, no world-shaking collapse. That solid basalt pillar, which required 2 people to encircle it, had its core structure instantly dismantled from within by an incomprehensible, highly condensed oscillatory force. It still stood there, but Shi Jian knew it was already dead. With just a light push, or even a slightly strong wind, it would crumble into a pile of uniform, fine sand shimmering with a crystalline glow. Toph slowly withdrew her fist and lightly flicked her wrist, as if just brushing off a bit of dust. Her hollow gray-green eyes turned toward Shi Jian. Though she couldn't see the shock on his face bordering on stupor, she could clearly sense his sudden cessation of breath and the violent pounding of his heart. This is called vibration. Toph's voice was calm, as if introducing the most ordinary tool. It's not about using brute force to smash. It's about using vibration to find the point where it doesn't want to be hit, and then telling it that it's time to break. She paused, her small chin tilting up slightly with a natural pride. That little strength of yours doesn't even count as an itch. Want revenge. Want to stop being treated like trouble. First, learn how to tell the stone to break, instead of ramming around like a bristling wild boar. Other than exhausting yourself and breaking a few floorboards, what else can you do? She took a step forward with her bare feet, stepping onto the sand she had vibrated into a dense state, making a light crunching sound. She stopped precisely less than a foot away from Shi Jian. Her hollow gaze seemed to pierce through his eyes, looking directly at the churning anger, humiliation, and the bottomless sea of blood and despair in the depths of his soul. Do you want to learn? Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a strange, piercing quality, like a cold chisel slamming into Shi Jian's solid mental defenses. Or would you rather go back and sit there, being your mute stone, waiting for your bones to rust and your brain to rot, until one day you're blown into a pile of shredded meat by your own power? I want to learn. Shi Jian's voice emerged with difficulty, carrying a heavy nasal tone and a hint of imperceptible trembling. He didn't know why a pampered, young lady from a wealthy family, and a blind one at that, possessed such formidable strength, but he knew clearly that this power might be the only driftwood he could grasp right now, the only thing that could rid him of the title of trouble, the only capital that would give him the right to speak of revenge. As long as it helped with his revenge, everything else didn't seem so important anymore. Toph's hollow gray-green eyes seemed to light up slightly, as if capturing that faint but firm spark in his voice. She said nothing more, simply turning around and walking toward the remaining basalt pillars in the center of the training ground, her voice drifting back faintly. Follow me. Feel the breath of the stone, and listen to the voice of the earth. Shi Jian looked at her slender yet exceptionally upright back, then looked down at his bandaged, still aching hand. Finally, he took a deep breath and took a heavy but unusually firm step, following her. A few days slipped quietly by within the refined yet oppressive confines of the Baifeng estate. Most of the bandages on Shi Jian's face had been removed, leaving only a few prominent scars that had yet to fully scab over, crawling across his skin like dark red earthworms. He no longer spent his days sitting idly in the pavilion or his room. Instead, he began following Ah Fu to handle the remaining paperwork of the Panshi family, mostly tedious tasks like confirming the survival of clansmen, inventorying manor losses, and consoling the families of old subordinates. Every page seemed soaked in a metallic scent of blood that couldn't be washed away, yet Shi Jian handled them with extraordinary calm. The rustling of his brush across the paper betrayed not a single ripple of emotion. He even took the initiative to seek out Baifeng family disciples in the courtyard to ask for guidance on basic earthbending control techniques. His attitude was as humble as an unpolished rough stone, yet his gaze was focused to the point of obsession. Occasionally, a slightly awkward but sufficiently sincere smile would appear on his face in response to others' greetings. To onlookers, the youth who had been crushed by a sea of blood-deep enmity seemed to be struggling his way out. Though his steps were heavy, he was finally moving forward. He became, like a normal, somewhat introverted but hard-working and cheerful young man. Only Shi Jian himself knew that the flame named revenge had never been extinguished. It was merely buried deep within the lowest layers of his consciousness, covered by a thick, cold shell of solid rock. Every time he flipped through those blood-stained files, every time he heard the servants discussing the friction at the Earth Kingdom borders, the lava beneath that shell roared and churned silently. He learned to control his power not to kill time, but to accumulate more precise and lethal energy for the eventual explosion. He was like a stubborn stone deliberately pressed into the grit to be ground down, his sharp edges temporarily retracted only so that, at the critical moment, he could more accurately shatter the enemy's skull. One evening, the afterglow of the setting sun plated the courtyard in a layer of warm gold, and even the bronze bells under the corridors were tinged with a gentle light. Shi Jian had just come out of Ah Fu's study, rubbing his throbbing temples and preparing to return to his room to rest. Hey, mute stone. That cool and direct voice rang out from behind him, like a small pebble tossed into a calm lake. Shi Jian paused and turned around. In the sunset light, Toph was walking toward him. She had changed out of her usual signature light green outfit into a set of training clothes that were easier to move in and showed more personal style. The top was a deep ochre sleeveless tunic, revealing firm and well-proportioned arm lines with muscle contours like small stones hidden under the skin. The bottom consisted of wide-legged pants of the same color, tucked neatly into gaiters. She was barefoot, her soles stained with a bit of dirt as if she had just returned from the training grounds. Her long black hair was still pinned up but more loosely, with a few stray strands hanging by her temples, making her baby fat-tinged face look less childish and more wildly unrestrained. Most striking was the green hair ornament pinned to her hair, shimmering in the sunset. This outfit instantly made Shi Jian think of the free-spirited wanderers on the northern wilderness. It was a stark contrast to her somewhat aloof, young mistress, image within the Baifeng estate. Follow me. Toph reached him without any nonsense. She tilted her head slightly, her small ears twitching as if capturing subtle changes in Shi Jian's breathing and heartbeat, like a vigilant young beast. Shi Jian's heart stirred slightly, but his face remained impassive. Where to? It's almost dark. The corners of Toph's mouth seemed to curve upward, an expression bordering on slyness flashing across her face so quickly it felt like an illusion. She leaned in a little closer, her voice dropping low with a sense of sharing a secret that was almost childishly mysterious, yet carried an unquestionable firmness. I'll tell you a secret, but don't tell anyone else. She deliberately dragged out the last word with a hint of playfulness before her tone shifted back to its directness. I'm taking you to a good place. Shi Jian grew more suspicious, his gaze sweeping over her bare feet. What kind of good place? You'll know when we get there. Toph didn't explain further and turned to leave, her bare feet making a light patter against the stone path, her steps light and steady. Shi Jian watched her back, hesitated for a moment, and then followed. They didn't take the main gate of the estate but instead wound through a secluded back garden. The roses in the garden were in full bloom but untended, petals littering the ground. Reaching a seemingly abandoned section of the wall, Toph stopped and pressed her hand against the stones. With a soft click, a slab of rock slid inward silently like a heavy stone door, revealing a pitch-black entrance extending downward. A murky heat wave mixed with dust, sweat, and cheap alcohol hit them, accompanied by a distant, muffled roar like thunder, the frantic shouts and screams of countless people, along with the sound of heavy objects slamming violently. Shi Jian's pupils constricted suddenly. This smell, this sound, instantly triggered the darkest images in the depths of his memory, the chaotic battlefield, the wails of the dying, the ear-piercing sound of metal striking rock. He subconsciously tensed his body, his knuckles turning slightly white as a cold vigilance and a faint, uncontrollable murderous intent surged within him. What? Scared? Toph seemed to sense his momentary stiffness and asked without looking back, her tone carrying a hint of amusement. She was the first to bend down and slip into the entrance. Shi Jian took a deep breath, suppressing his churning emotions, and his gaze became deep and calm once more. He followed closely behind, entering the dark downward passage. The stone door closed silently behind them, cutting off the last light of the sunset. The passage was narrow and steep, only wide enough for one person. The walls were rough and cold, seeping with water droplets, and his fingertips could feel fine grit as they brushed past. The steps beneath were slippery and covered in grime, a mixture of soil and unknown stains that occasionally let out a creak when stepped on. The murky air grew thicker, and the deafening waves of sound hit his eardrums like a physical force, becoming clearer and clearer, carrying a primal, blood-pumping madness. After walking for about 15 minutes, a flickering, dim yellow light appeared ahead. The noise reached a crescendo, as if countless people were screaming right in his ears. At the end of the passage, the view suddenly opened up. A massive underground space beyond imagination unfolded before Shi Jian's eyes. It looked like a hollowed-out mountain interior, with a soaring dome and jagged rocks, some rocks hung down like the fangs of a giant beast. Huge, crude torches and oil lamps were thrust into the cracks of the rock walls, providing the primary light source and casting flickering shadows over the space, creating a bizarre and fanatical atmosphere. In the center of the space was a massive octagonal arena built from thick logs and heavy stone. The rocks at the edge of the arena were covered in dents, as if they had been struck countless times. Surrounding the arena were crude stone bleachers extending upward like terraced fields. At this moment, the bleachers were packed with people. They were dressed in all sorts of ways. Well-dressed merchants clutching banknotes and screaming, travel-worn mercenaries cheering while patting the weapons at their waists, rough craftsmen stomping their feet with bare arms, and even some warriors with sinister gazes and fierce auras unconsciously tapping the stone steps. Everyone seemed possessed, waving their arms and shouting themselves hoarse. The massive waves of sound converged into a terrifying, suffocating pressure. On the arena, a crude and barbaric duel was taking place. A burly, bare-chested man with skin glowing with a rock-like grayish-white luster was roaring as he swung a massive stone hammer, slamming it toward his opponent, a small, agile man who moved like a mole. That man avoided the stone hammer by a hair's breadth, his body sliding eerily along the ground as his hands suddenly plunged into the arena floor. Rumble. The hard rock arena beneath the burly man's feet instantly softened and collapsed. It was like falling into quicksand. The man's massive frame sank abruptly, and his stone hammer hit the ground, sending stone fragments flying. A few pieces bounced into the front row spectators, but no one cared. Instead, they cheered even harder. He roared, trying to pull his legs out, but more rocks coiled around him like living things, tightening like snakes. Quicksand technique. Shi Jian's gaze sharpened. This was a very practical earthbending technique, extremely threatening in actual combat. But this arena, he noticed that the range of the quicksand was precisely controlled to a tiny area beneath the man's feet, while the rest of the arena remained as hard as iron. This kind of control was far beyond what those showy performers at the estate training grounds could match. The man's eyes flashed with ruthlessness as his body launched from the ground like a spring, a sharp stone spike appearing in his hand as he stabbed toward the burly man's immobilized throat. The atmosphere in the bleachers was instantly ignited to its peak. The frantic shouting nearly blew the roof off the cave. Just as the stone spike was about to pierce the skin. Roar. The burly man let out a heaven-shaking roar. The muscles on his arms bulged as he suddenly jerked them apart. The rock restraints coiling around his legs were actually shattered by sheer brute force. Amidst flying stone shards, his left hand shot out like lightning, grabbing the incoming stone spike. The spike was crushed to powder in his hand like a dry twig. His other massive stone fist, carrying the whistling sound of wind, slammed heavily into the man's chest. PFF'd. The clear sound of bones snapping was drowned out by the thunderous cheers. The man's body flew back like a broken sack, slamming heavily into the rock guardrail at the edge of the arena with a dull thud before sliding down limply, blood spraying from his mouth and nose, his fate unknown. A tall, thin man acting as a referee jumped onto the arena. Though thin, he was actually quite robust, with veins bulging on his arms. He raised the burly man's arm, shouting something at the top of his lungs. The mountain-shaking roar of, "Stone Demon! Stone Demon! Stone Demon!" instantly filled the entire underground space. Shi Jian's breathing became slightly hurried. The battles here were primal, bloody, and direct. There was no stopping at the point of contact, no complex rules, only the purest violence and survival. Every person standing on that arena had a beast-like glint in their eyes, a hunger for victory, or rather, for staying alive. This environment, this pressure, was exactly what he needed. The power within his body was restless, yearning to stand on that stage, yearning to use the most direct method to vent, to hone, and to become familiar with the sensation of killing. How is it? More exciting than at the estate, right? Toph's voice rang in his ear, carrying a trace of imperceptible excitement. She tilted her head slightly as if enjoying the atmosphere, her bare toes curling and pressing into the dust on the ground. Shi Jian didn't answer. His gaze was as sharp as a hawk's, scanning the fanatical spectators, the bloody arena, and the dark corners. He was evaluating, memorizing, and searching for everything he could utilize. Toph didn't mind his silence, leading him with practiced ease through the crowded, foul-smelling edges of the bleachers toward a higher point. As she approached, the crowd seemed to be pushed aside by an invisible force, automatically opening a gap. Many people who saw her, especially her headband and bare feet, showed looks of awe, wariness, and even fanaticism. Low whispers spread through the crowd. "It's the blind bandit. Is she going to fight tonight? Who's that kid behind her? A new face. Blind bandit." Shi Jian caught the title. He looked at the petite back ahead of him, moving steadily through the crowd like a reef parting the sea, and his understanding of this, fiancé, was refreshed once again. Here, she clearly held an extraordinary status and a fearsome reputation. Toph eventually stopped at a relatively independent stone platform with an excellent view. It was like a small, private box, with only a stone table and a few stone stools. She sat down casually, resting her bare feet on the edge of the stone table in a relaxed and natural posture, as if this were her throne. Sit. Shi Jian sat as instructed, his gaze still locked onto the bloody and violent octagonal arena below. A new opponent had already taken the stage, and the battle had begun once more. The clashing of metal, the explosion of rocks, muffled groans of pain, and frantic shouts intertwined to form a barbaric symphony. Toph turned her body, her hollow gaze, seemingly piercing through the noise to fall on Shi Jian. Her small nose twitched slightly, as if distinguishing the complex aura radiating from him, a mixture of vigilance, desire, and a hint of bloodthirst. See it clearly? She suddenly asked, her voice reaching Shi Jian's ears clearly despite the deafening background noise. The stones here aren't those pretty, dead things in the training grounds. They bleed, they wail, and they take lives. She paused, the corners of her mouth curling into a nearly cruel arc that looked exceptionally eerie on her baby fat-tinged face. Want to try, mute stone. I only see staged fights and capital, they've clearly had professional training. Every move looks violent, but in fact, every move is deliberate. They look heavily injured, but they'll actually recover in a few days, Shi Jian replied, withdrawing his gaze from the arena to look at Toph. If I go up there, it'll be different. Toph raised an eyebrow at his words as if she had heard something interesting, a flash of intrigue crossing her eyes. Shi Jian's cold and sharp evaluation, I only saw fixed matches and capital, was like a drop of water into boiling oil, instantly stirring deeper ripples on Toph's wild and untamable face. The nearly cruel curve of her mouth suddenly deepened, turning into a brilliant smile filled with challenge and even a hint of bloodthirsty excitement. Her white teeth glinted coldly under the flickering firelight. She leaned forward abruptly, nearly crossing the stone table, her seemingly hollow gaze, that seemed capable of piercing the soul firmly locking onto the restless, low growling beast named Revenge, within Shi Jian's body. Oh. Her voice trailed upward with a hint of cat and mouse playfulness. Immediately after, that playfulness was replaced by a decisive, unquestionable certainty. Her voice wasn't loud, but it struck the noisy background like an invisible hammer. It'll be different once I go up there. Before her words even faded, Toph's bare feet had already lightly dropped from the edge of the stone table, landing steadily on the rough, cold rocky ground. She didn't look at Shi Jian again, as if her declaration just now was merely a notice rather than a request for an opinion. Her small figure crouched slightly on the massive stone platform, then, like an arrow leaving a bow, she leapt toward the octagonal arena below. She didn't use the stairs or take a detour. She chose the most direct and shocking path, straight down from the top of the high stands. Whoa! She's going down. The blind bandit is entering the ring. Look! The crowded masses below were like boiling water into which a giant boulder had been tossed, instantly erupting into a wave of sound even more fanatical than when the stone demon had won. Countless eyes, filled with awe, fear, and extreme excitement, focused in unison on that petite figure plummeting like a meteorite. Shi Jian's pupils suddenly constricted. He stood up abruptly, his hands instinctively bracing against the edge of the cold stone table, his knuckles turning slightly white from the force. His gaze followed the figure intently, his heart pounding heavily against his ribs. Toph did not panic in midair, her body unfurled with incredible flexibility and coordination. On her way down, her small bare feet precisely and lightly tapped against protruding rocks or thick wooden support beams on the edges of several tiers of stands to gain momentum. Each light touch was accompanied by a subtle vibration, like a pebble tossed into a pond, rippling out invisible waves beneath her feet. These vibration waves, nearly imperceptible to ordinary people, fed back the precise location of every inch of terrain and every obstacle below into her brain. Thud, thud, thud. Her movements were as fast as a phantom, light as if weightless, yet carrying the force of 1,000 tons. Each step was accompanied by a crisp, metallic clink, the sound of pure power colliding with rock. The crowd near her landing points cried out as they scrambled to dodge, the chaos mixed with cries of pain and curses from being trampled. In just a few breaths, that dark ochre figure, like a precision-guided shell, crashed into the center of the octagonal arena with the sound of rushing wind. Boom! A dull, heart-stopping crash. The entire massive arena, along with its solid foundation, seemed to be shaken by her violent landing. Centered on the spot where her bare feet hit, a visible web of fine cracks instantly spread across the hard stone arena. The resulting stone dust billowed like smoke, forming a hazy veil in the dim, flickering firelight. In this moment, the entire noisy underground space fell into a brief, vacuum-like silence. The blind bandit is here. Toph shouted. All the shouting, hissing, and roaring were instantly choked off by an invisible giant hand. Countless eyes widened in disbelief, watching the petite figure slowly straighten up amidst the dust on the stage. The dust cleared slightly. Toph stood firm in the center of the arena, her bare feet planted steadily at the center of the web of cracks she had created. Her dark ochre sleeveless tunic outlined her firm, fluid lines, and her wide-legged trousers fluttered slightly in the turbulent air. That small green hair ornament, like a spark of unyielding life, shone stubbornly amidst the pervasive dust and scent of blood. She tilted her head slightly, her small ears twitching almost imperceptibly, as if listening to the residual vibrations of the arena beneath her feet, and as if capturing the heavy heartbeats of the entire underground space that had stopped because of her. Her posture was relaxed, even a bit lazy, as if she had just casually strolled here. However, the invisible aura she radiated, as solid as a mountain yet as sharp as a blade, made the entire space hold its breath. The stone demon's mountain-like, muscular frame stood at the edge of the arena, only a few yards away from her. He had just finished enjoying the winner's cheers, and the arrogance and ferocity of a victor had not yet completely faded from his face before being frozen by this opponent who had descended from the sky in such a shocking manner. Beneath his grayish-white rocky skin, his muscles tensed with alertness, and he instinctively held his massive stone hammer in front of him, as if facing a small but extremely dangerous beast that had suddenly intruded into his territory. For the first time, a look of solemnity appeared in his bell-like eyes, and even, a hint of wariness that he hadn't even noticed himself. The referee, a tall, lean, and sharp-eyed man with a cold gaze, also tensed his body, standing in the corner of the arena and staring sharply at Toph, seemingly evaluating this sudden turn of events. Toph's hollow gaze slowly swept across the silent stands, past the stone demon who was as if facing a great enemy, and finally, seemingly inadvertently, she tilted her chin slightly toward the high stone platform where Shi Jian was. Although she couldn't see, the meaning conveyed by this gesture was clearly imprinted in Shi Jian's eyes. Watch closely, mute stone. This is what different really means. Then, she turned toward the stone demon, who still maintained a defensive posture. Her face was expressionless, holding only a calmness like the frozen soil of the north. She extended her right hand and lightly beckoned with her index finger toward her opponent, who was several times larger than her. A gesture simple to the extreme, yet filled with infinite contempt and provocation. Boom. The brief silence was instantly ignited. The audience in the stands erupted like a powder keg, letting out unprecedented, frenzied roars that nearly blew off the entire underground dome. Blind bandit! Blind bandit! Blind bandit! Tear him apart! Go, stone demon! Crush that midget! Bloodthirsty fanaticism once again ruled this underground kingdom. Everyone knew that a clash far exceeding any before, a true life and death collision belonging to top-tier earthbenders, was about to explode on this blood-stained octagonal arena. The stone demon was completely enraged by that blatant provocation. The last trace of wariness in his eyes was replaced by a violent fury. A roar even more deafening than before erupted from his throat, like a wounded giant bear. He no longer hesitated, his massive body lunged forward, his heavy steps making the arena rumble. That terrifyingly large stone hammer was swung with one hand, carrying a horrifying, air-tearing shriek like a collapsing mountain, as it smashed down with all its might toward the tiny but lethally threatening figure in the center of the arena, without any fancy tricks. A powerful wind blew against her face, stirring the hair at Toph's temples. A massive shadow instantly enveloped her. Shi Jian stood high above, his body as tense as a bowstring, his eyes locked onto the scene below. He could clearly see the destructive trajectory of the stone hammer as it fell, and how fragile Toph's petite figure appeared under the massive shadow. His breathing was held, the dormant power within him roaring wildly, as if urging him to rush down, and as if trembling with excitement for the coming collision. At the critical moment when the stone hammer was about to crush Toph into a pulp, Toph moved. She didn't retreat, and she didn't dodge. Facing the falling shadow of destruction, she slammed her bare foot against the ground. Boom. A crash even more muffled and shocking than when she had landed exploded. This time, the rock beneath her feet didn't just shatter into a web, it was as if it had been struck hard from below by an invisible giant fist. A whole slab of hard arena rock, several feet in diameter and half a foot thick, was actually jolted upward by the force of her stomp, shattering and then exploding upward like a detonated bomb. Countless sharp rock fragments, like buckshot accelerated by an invisible giant force, carried a shriek that tore through the air, forming a lethal, upward erupting torrent that collided head-on with the falling massive stone hammer. Toph's seemingly delicate stomp had triggered a power like a landslide. Countless sharp rock fragments, as if summoned from the depths of hell by an invisible giant force, carried a shriek that tore through the air, forming a lethal, upward erupting torrent of shrapnel that collided head-on with the falling massive stone hammer. Clang, 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 clang. The sound of dense impacts, enough to make one's scalp tingle, instantly exploded. The hard fragments were like hail hitting steel, bursting into countless fine sparks and stone dust on the surface of the massive stone hammer. That trajectory, which had the momentum of 10,000 tons, was actually stalled and knocked off course by this violent, gravel buckshot. The stone demon's massive frame shuddered violently. The immense impact was transmitted through the stone hammer to his arms, numbing his hands and making his arm muscles tremble violently. He roared, trying to steady the hammer's momentum and force it down. But more rock fragments had already bypassed the face of the hammer like venomous bees, pelting his skin and his unprotected face and head. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The hard fragments hit his skin with dull thuds, leaving behind clear white marks. Some sharp edges, though they didn't cut his skin, caused him intense pain. He didn't have a single visible wound on the surface, but his pained expression certainly didn't seem fooled. Even more terrifying were the fragments flying toward his face, forcing him to hastily raise his thick arms to block, instantly obscuring his vision. In that flash of lightning, as the stone demon was battered into a pathetic state by the storm of fragments and his offensive was completely halted. Toph's figure moved. She didn't pause for a second, as if that earth-shattering stomp just now was merely the introductory drumbeat. Before the dust from the erupting rock could settle, she had already darted out across the ground like a phantom. Her petite figure pulled a blurred afterimage under the dim, flickering firelight, her speed exceeding what ordinary eyes could capture. Her target was not the stone demon himself. It was the patch of arena floor beneath his feet, the area that had just been struck by the stone hammer and then shattered by her stomp, and was not yet completely stable. Shi Jian saw it clearly from his high vantage point. His heart was nearly in his throat. Toph's choice of timing, angle, and target were all suffocatingly precise. She took advantage of the stone demon's massive size and the instability of his center of gravity from blocking the fragments, and even more so, she utilized the weakest area of the arena that she herself had created. Toph rushed to the edge of the cracked rock slab, her body nearly parallel to the ground. Her bare foot stomped out again like lightning. This time, it wasn't a violent upward explosion, but a precise stomp like a drill, concentrating a terrifying, piercing power. Thud. A sound so muffled it was extreme, like a giant boulder falling into a deep pool. Centered on the point where her toes landed, a condensed, invisible vibration wave rippled out like a pebble tossed into water. But these ripples didn't go outward, she skillfully guided them like countless invisible steel needles, stabbing deep into the already loosened rock layers below. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of rock shattering set teeth on edge. That patch of arena rock, already full of cracks, completely collapsed and disintegrated under this precisely piercing vibration force, like building blocks having their last support removed. The stone demon's massive frame was standing right on this area. He only felt the ground beneath him suddenly vanish. He fell downward irresistibly, as if standing on a suddenly collapsing quicksand trap. The immense sense of weightlessness made him let out a roar of shock and fury. His massive body and heavy stone hammer instead became burdens that accelerated his fall. Rumble. Dust and rock fragments shot into the sky. A pit nearly 10 feet in diameter and several feet deep abruptly appeared in the center of the arena. The previously majestic and overbearing stone demon now had only half his chest and a furiously roaring head exposed at the edge of the pit. Everything below his waist, along with that massive stone hammer, was firmly wedged and buried by the shattered rock. He struggled violently, attempting to break free with brute force, but the surrounding rocks only let out unsettling groans and finer cracking sounds under his immense twisting, pinning him even tighter. He was like a giant beast fallen into a hunter's trap, possessing brute strength but nowhere to use it, left only to roar in futility. The entire underground space fell into an eerie, deathly silence once more. Only the stone demon's unwilling roars echoed through the air. Everyone was utterly stunned by this lightning-fast, cognition-shattering scene. From Toph shattering the arena to trigger a stone storm that stalled the hammer, to her charging across the ground to precisely create the pit to trap her enemy, the entire process flowed like water, happening in a mere 2 or 3 breaths. Violent power and exquisite, subtle control reached a terrifyingly perfect unity in that petite figure. Blind bandit. Someone was the first to scream it at the top of their lungs. Immediately following, it spread like a wildfire across the plains. Blind bandit. Blind bandit. Blind bandit. Beautifully done. Kill him. A roar far more fanatical and crazed than when the stone demon had one erupted from the stands. With absolute strength and cold efficiency, Toph had instantly conquered this mob that believed only in power. They looked at the figure standing barefoot in the center of the arena, as calm as if she had merely stepped on an ant, their eyes filled with a near-religious fanatical worship. Toph stood at the edge of the pit, head slightly lowered, looking down at the stone demon struggling in vain like a trapped beast. Her baby fat face wore a smirk that was both arrogant and wild. She slowly raised her right hand, fingers spread and palm down, aiming it at that head twisted by rage and humiliation in the pit. An invisible, heart-palpitating sense of pressure instantly permeated the air. The surrounding air seemed to freeze. Tiny pebbles at the edge of the pit began to jump and tremble uncontrollably. The stone demon's roars came to a screeching halt. He felt a lethal threat. A massive, primal fear of death instantly seized him. He twisted his body desperately, trying to pull his head down, but the rocks pinning him didn't budge an inch. He could only look up in despair at that slender palm, as if seeing the raised scythe of the Grim Reaper. The referee's face changed drastically in the corner. He leaned forward as if to rush up and stop it, but he was intimidated by Toph's terrifying strength and the current aura, his feet remaining nailed to the spot. Shi Jian stood on the high stone platform, his body still tense, but his gaze had changed. The initial shock and worry were replaced by a deep, tempered sharpness. He watched Toph's palm hovering over the pit, condensing destructive power, and saw the stone demon's desperate, fearful eyes. The lava within him named revenge seemed to be strongly stimulated by this extreme violence and control, beginning to churn and roar even more turbulently. He needed this power. He craved this absolute control over life and death. Just as everyone thought the stone demon was about to have his head utterly crushed by Toph's thunderous methods. Toph's palm, which had condensed terrifying power, slowly and steadily lowered. The suffocating field around her dissipated along with it. She simply looked at the stone demon in the pit and asked clearly in her unique voice, not loud, but piercing through the brief silence. Yielded yet, big guy. The entire underground space was so quiet a pin could be heard dropping. All the shouts and screams seemed to be throttled once more by an invisible hand. Countless eyes stared fixedly at the stone demon in the pit. The stone demon's face, twisted by fear, twitched violently, veins bulging under his grayish skin. Humiliation, unwillingness, rage, various emotions intertwined crazily in his eyes. But ultimately, under the shadow of death brought by that palm that had just been lowered but could still take his life at any moment, all emotions turned into the deepest fear and submission. He laboriously and extremely slowly nodded his massive head. An indistinct yet unmistakable syllable came from his throat. Yield. His voice was hoarse, filled with the trembling of a survivor. A tiny, almost satisfied expression flickered across Toph's face, gone in an instant. She no longer looked at the stone demon, as if what she was stepping on was merely an eyesore of a stone. Her hollow gaze slowly rose, piercing through the silence following the clamor, and with a faint hint of provocation, cast itself once more toward the figure standing like a monolith on the high stone platform, Shi Jian. See that? That silent gaze seemed to say. This is what power should look like. Toph got the answer she wanted, a simple, humiliating, yet incredibly real, yield. The slight satisfaction on her face was like a crack on ice, vanishing in a flash. She didn't look again at the stone demon panting like a trapped beast beneath her feet, his eyes a mix of fear and resentment, as if he were just a stumbling block that needed clearing. Her hollow gaze pierced through the dust yet to settle in the underground space and the silence after the clamor, precisely and with a hint of scrutiny, casting itself again toward the figure standing like a monolith on the high stone platform, Shi Jian. See that? That arrogant gaze was like cold steel needles, piercing the silence after the noise and stabbing deep into Shi Jian's eyes. This is what power should look like. Pure, efficient, crushing all obstacles. Not playing house, and not a plaything of capital. Shi Jian received the message. Deep within his pool-like eyes, beneath the layer of forcibly suppressed ice, the lava named revenge was churning and roaring with unprecedented fury under Toph's demonstration of extreme violence and absolute control. He needed this power. He craved this absolute power to crush enemies under his feet and control their lives. Toph had used the most direct method to light his fuse and point the way. Power should be used like this. The fanaticism in the stands continued, the deafening shouts of blind bandit washing over the massive underground space like waves, but the protagonist in the center of the arena had lost interest. Toph was oblivious to the surrounding clamor, she didn't even acknowledge the referee in the corner who looked conflicted and hesitant to speak. Her small barefoot toes lightly tapped the arena floor covered in rubble and cracks, and her body drifted up as if weightless. With a few precise leaps, her figure flickered several times in the dim light and shadows before landing lightly back on the high stone platform where Shi Jian was. She still carried the dust of the arena and a faint scent of saltpeter. A few loose strands of hair on her forehead were slightly dampened by sweat, but that small green hair ornament still sparkled stubbornly. She didn't look at Shi Jian, walking straight to the stone table to pick up a small waterskin placed there at some point, unscrewing the cap and taking a few gulps of fresh water. Droplets slid down her sharp jawline, dripping onto her dark ochre vest and leaving dark marks. Let's go. She put down the waterskin, her voice cold and direct, as if she wasn't the one who had just created a pit and controlled life and death in the arena. No explanation, no showing off, not even an inquiry about Shi Jian's feelings. Shi Jian withdrew his gaze from the massive pit below and the stone demon still struggling in vain, finally letting it rest on Toph's dust-covered bare feet. He nodded in silence and followed behind her without a word. The way back was still that narrow, steep, murky-smelling dark passage. But this time, the passage was no longer filled with only the monotonous footsteps of two people. The earth-shaking clamor behind them grew distant and blurred as if separated by a thick curtain, yet it was branded deep into Shi Jian's mind. The primal shouts, the bloody scent, the roar of colliding power, and that shocking scene of Toph shattering the arena like a descending deity. In the passage, only the echoes of their footsteps on the damp stone steps remained, along with the thumping of Shi Jian's own heavy heart, which felt as if it were burning with lava. Toph walked in front, her bare feet treading on the cold, slippery steps, every step as steady as a rock. She seemed to sense the hot, suppressed fluctuations of breath behind her that threatened to burst from Shi Jian's chest. Her small ears twitched imperceptibly, and the corners of her mouth seemed to curl upward again in a fleeting arc of knowing and a trace of subtle satisfaction. Passing through the desolate back garden, the scent of decaying leaves diluted some of the murkiness from underground. When the heavy stone door disguised as a rock slid open silently again, the cool night air of the Baifeng estate instantly rushed into their noses, carrying the slight chill of the garden's greenery, along with a suffocating sense of exquisite and oppressive order. The estate was silent, save for the distant, rhythmic, and rigid footsteps of the night guards. Warm yellow lanterns under the eaves emitted a soft but heatless light, clearly illuminating the neatly trimmed trees and orderly stone paths. Compared to the wild, bloody, power-is-everything world underground, everything here seemed so fake and fragile, like a meticulously constructed stage set. Toph familiarly led Shi Jian, avoiding the patrol routes, moving like two silent shadows through the estate's complex corridors and courtyards. She seemed to know every door and every shadow here like the back of her hand. Finally, they returned to the entrance of the remote courtyard where Shi Jian lived. The courtyard gate was tightly shut, and inside it was pitch black and silent. Toph stopped at the gate and turned to face Shi Jian. The light from the lanterns under the eaves hit her face at an angle, half bright and half hidden in shadow. Those hollow eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, looking directly into the depths of Shi Jian's soul. Her small nostrils twitched slightly again, as if confirming the lingering underground scent on him and his still boiling state of mind. She didn't speak, only tilting her head slightly, the green hair ornament flashing a bit of light in the lantern glow. A silent inquiry, a gaze waiting for confirmation. Shi Jian stood in the shadows, his figure as straight as a spear. The crazed clamor of the underground world and Toph's shocking, crushing victory were like quenching water and lava, violently colliding and merging within him. He raised his eyes to meet Toph's gaze, which seemed to see through everything. Deep within his pool-like eyes, the ice had completely melted, replaced by a settled, deeper, and more dangerous undercurrent. Within that undercurrent was a vengeful will that had grown firmer through tempering, and a clearer, colder understanding of the essence of power. He nodded slowly and with extreme solemnity. No words were needed, this action itself was the most powerful answer to Toph's silent inquiry and a promise to the lava within his own heart. Toph got the response she wanted. A smile appeared on her baby fat face, and those hollow eyes seemed to flicker slightly, like a pebble thrown into a deep pool causing a ripple. Wait. Toph stopped and turned back in confusion. Then you'd better not go, at least next time go to somewhere more formal. Toph nodded and turned to leave with a smile, her bare feet stepping on the cold stone slabs, her figure quickly disappearing into the deeper shadows of the adjacent courtyard, like a wisp of wind merging into the night. On this day, Bathing Wind was sitting in his room handling various trivial matters of the Panchi family. The major affairs and trade relations of the family were still managed by Ah Fu. Piled by his hand were several scrolls regarding land rents and taxes, his fingertips traced over the yellowed paper, his brow slightly furrowed as he cross-checked a discrepancy in the figures. Suddenly, there was a soft sound from the room door, a knock carrying a hint of hesitation. Who is it? Bathing Wind looked up, his voice calm. From outside the door came a female voice that sounded slightly soft and sweet, yet hid a touch of awkwardness. It's me. Come in. The door was pushed open gently, and Toph walked in. She was wearing a light green and white high-waisted ruchun, just as she did back at the Baifeng family's estate. The hem was embroidered with intricate vine patterns, and a silk cord of the same color was tied around her waist, making her figure appear even more slender. Her hair was still meticulously pinned up, with 2 strands of stray hair hanging by her temples, adding a touch of gentleness. Standing at the door with her eyelids slightly lowered, she looked weak and well-behaved as she spoke softly toward the outside. I've arrived, you two can head back first. Yes, miss. From outside the door came the low responses of 2 maidservants, followed by the sound of footsteps fading into the distance. Toph closed the door behind her, and the moment she turned around, that gentle and submissive appearance vanished like smoke scattered by the wind. Shi Jian was looking at her in confusion, but before he could speak, he saw her leap nimbly onto his bed. She bluntly crossed her legs, resting her left hand casually on her knee while her right index finger poked into her nostril twice. My dad said, she remarked nonchalantly, go find Shi Jian when you're free, spend more time with him, and get more familiar with each other. After all, you'll be together in the future. There, those were his words. Shi Jian, having long grown accustomed to her instant switching between 2 faces, merely raised an eyebrow helplessly. So, you're really so bored that you made a special trip to find me. Toph flicked away a booger from her fingertip, her eyes lighting up with an irrepressible excitement in her tone. Didn't you say last time to, at least find a more formal venue next time? I've been sneaking out these past few days and found a massive arena in the underground of Jailing Town. There's a competition there, I think it's called the Earth Strength Hegemony Tournament. She became more animated as she spoke, gesturing wildly. Though it's a bit less violent and bloody compared to the venues up north, they actually give prizes to the champion. Watching her eyes shine with excitement and listening to her vivid description, the unmasked joy on her face unexpectedly made Shi Jian feel that this fiancé looked somewhat pleasing to the eye at this moment. He shook his head violently to cast aside this sudden thought and asked in a low voice, the venues you went to before didn't have prizes or prize money. Nope. Toph's answer was simple and direct as her fingertips tapped on the edge of the bed. Those places are just for people seeking combat to gather and fight. The organizers only provide the venue and the opportunity, they're the ones making all the money from the bets. So, Shi Jian drew out the word, waiting for her to continue. So I'm inviting you to go check it out with me. Toph immediately put on a pitiful expression, blinking her eyes as her voice softened into a deliberate, coquettish tone, won't my fiancé give me a chance tilde? Shi Jian watched Toph's face instantly switch to a pitiful, expectant look, and his mouth couldn't help but twitch. This young miss of the Baifeng family practically personified duplicity to the extreme in front of him. One moment she was a dignified and fragile noble lady, and the next she could be picking her nose on a bed with her legs crossed like a street thug. Even more ridiculous was her ability to seamlessly switch back to acting cute. Won't my fiancé give me a chance? Shi Jian intentionally mimicked her affected tone with obvious teasing. It's truly a waste for someone with your face-changing skills not to join a theater troupe. Toph immediately dropped her pitiful act and curled her lip. TCH, ungrateful. Just say whether you're going or not. I heard the champion's prize this time is a piece of extremely high purity, ink jade marrow. It's of great benefit to earth sect cultivation. Her eyes were sparkling, clearly having coveted this prize for a long time. Earth Strength Hegemony Tournament. Jailing Town Underground. Quote. Shi Jian mused, his fingers unconsciously tapping the tabletop. Having handled Panchi family affairs for a long time, he wasn't entirely ignorant of the existence of certain gray areas within the territory, but he hadn't expected the scale to be so large that even a newcomer like Toph could precisely find the entrance. You certainly are well informed. However, that kind of place is a mixed bag of people. Do you really think it's appropriate? What's inappropriate about it? Toph waved her hand dismissively. What kind of scene hasn't this lady seen? Besides, she winked cunningly with a bit of pride, isn't the Panchi young master right here? Who would dare touch me? Even if some blind fool tries, the two of us together will beat them until they're looking for their teeth on the ground. Shi Jian felt like laughing at her fearless attitude, but he maintained a serious expression. He did indeed need to understand these murky corners of the territory. Seeing it for himself was better than just listening to reports. Moreover, he was also curious about the ink jade marrow Toph mentioned. More importantly, looking at her face beaming with excitement, those gray-green eyes that were usually cunning or feigned weakness now flickering with a pure desire for battle and treasure, Shi Jian found that he really couldn't bring himself to say no. Fine. Shi Jian finally relented, his tone carrying a hint of helplessness yet also hiding a trace of imperceptible indulgence. I'll treat it as, observing the local conditions. When? Tonight. At the hour of the rat. Seeing her goal achieved, Toph bounced up from the bed with excitement, nearly hitting the low ceiling beam. I know a secret passage, avoiding my family's patrols will be easy. The hour of the rat. Shi Jian frowned. Does your father know you're running out so late? Oh, if you don't say anything and I don't say anything, who will know? Toph waved it off with an, it's fine, expression. My dad only said to spend more time with you, he didn't specify day or night. Going on an adventure together at night, isn't that even better for increasing our understanding? She intentionally emphasized the words, increasing our understanding, with a mischievous smile. Shi Jian was momentarily rendered speechless by her words. This fiancé of his always had a set of twisted logic that he often found himself unable to refute. Also, Toph leaned in closer and lowered her voice, sounding a bit mysterious. I heard there are a few experts coming from the south this time. Their style is very wild, different from our northern style or your Panchi family's style. Don't you want to go see for yourself? These words accurately struck Shi Jian's curiosity as a martial artist. He looked up, meeting Toph's gray eyes which flickered with excitement and provocation, and finally let out a helpless sigh, though the corners of his mouth curled into a tiny arc he hadn't even noticed. Understood. Hour of the rat, behind the rockery in the back garden. Shi Jian compromised, adding, remember to change into some nimble clothes. Is that ruchun you're wearing meant for a banquet or for the arena? Toph looked down at her exquisite high-waisted ruchun and giggled. Don't worry, this lady has long been prepared. See you tonight, my dear fiancé Tilda. She intentionally dragged out the last word, then jumped off the bed like a nimble cat, returning to the gentle, eyes downcast appearance she had when she entered. She opened the door softly and spoke sweetly toward the direction where maid servants might be. I've finished talking with young master Shi Jian, I'm heading back now. After saying that, she turned back and made a huge face at Shi Jian before, obediently, closing the door and leaving. The room became quiet again. Shi Jian looked at the empty bed, where it felt as though Toph's lively aura still lingered. He rubbed his brow, feeling that handling a whole morning of family trivia wasn't as tiring as dealing with this fiancé for a single hour. But strangely, this exhaustion wasn't annoying, instead, it carried a bit of novelty and anticipation. He shook his head to clear the strange thought, his gaze falling back onto the scrolls on the desk, but his thoughts had already drifted far away. The hour of the rat, the underground arena, the Earth Strength Hegemony tournament, and Toph's unmasked excitement, tonight was destined not to be peaceful. Thinking of the sparkling look in Toph's eyes when she described their opponents, the fire belonging to a martial artist deep within Shi Jian's heart was also quietly ignited. He wanted to see what kind of wild style could make this haughty little blind princess of the Baifeng family so interested. Just after the hour of the rat, the back garden of the Panchi residence was immersed in deep silence. The moonlight was obscured by heavy clouds, with only a few scattered stars stubbornly flickering, casting vague halos of light. In the craggy shadows of the rockery, Shi Jian stood as silently as a true rock, his presence retracted near perfectly. He was wearing dark gray martial attire suitable for movement, with an inconspicuous short coat of the same color over it. At his waist hung his accustomed long sword, its hilt worn smooth and warm. His sharp gaze scanned the surroundings, confirming that the patrol guard had just turned the corner. An extremely faint rustle, almost merging with the night wind, came from the other side of the rockery. Shi Jian's eyes flickered as a figure much smaller than him, also wearing dark and nimble martial attire, darted out like a spirit cat. The newcomer was Toph. Her previously pinned-up hair was now tied into a high ponytail, with a few unruly strands hanging over her forehead, adding a bit of heroic spirit. That sophisticated ruchun had been replaced by tight-fitting dark green clothes and trousers, outlining the vigorous lines unique to a young girl. Over it, she wore a similarly dark short cloak with the hood resting casually behind her head. Occasionally, moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating those gray-green eyes that shone brightly even in the dark, dancing with the pure flames of excitement for adventure. Quite punctual, young master Shi Jian. Toph lowered her voice, leaning in with a hint of a mischievous smile. Cut the chatter. Shi Jian was brief, his gaze quickly scanning her to confirm there were no cumbersome decorations. Where is the secret passage? Follow me. Toph wasted no more words and turned to dive into the depths of the rockery. Her familiarity with this place surprised Shi Jian. He saw her stop and take a stance by an unremarkable, moss-covered boulder, as if triggering an extremely hidden mechanism. Accompanied by a low grinding sound of stone that was almost inaudible, the bottom of the boulder actually slid inward to reveal an opening only large enough for a person to pass through by bending over. A cold wind smelling of earth and old dust gushed out from within. Impressive. Shi Jian praised sincerely. Even he, the young master of the Panchi family, might not have been fully aware of a secret passage of this level. Of course, look who made it. Toph raised her chin proudly and was the first to bend down and crawl in. Shi Jian followed closely, careful not to touch the walls. The entrance closed silently behind him, and the last trace of faint skylight was cut off, plunging them into pitch-black darkness where one couldn't see their own hand. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the air stale. Toph, however, acted as if she were strolling in her own backyard. Her footsteps were light and accurate, clearly not her first time walking here. She didn't even need illumination, seemingly able to perceive every rise and fall of the tunnel. Shi Jian, relying on his superhuman perception and familiarity with the Panchi aura, followed the blurry silhouette ahead closely. In the darkness, only the faint sound of their breathing and the rustle of fabric could be heard. Hey, Shi Jian. Toph's voice sounded a bit muffled in the narrow space. Are you nervous? Nervous about what? Shi Jian asked back, his tone steady. Going behind the adults, backs for the first time, crawling through a tunnel at midnight with your fiancé to see underground fighting. Toph's voice carried an obvious smile. Doesn't it sound very exciting? I'm more worried that you'll tear the arena apart. Shi Jian spoke the truth. TCH, you underestimate me. Toph snorted in dissatisfaction. This lady has a sense of propriety. I'm just watching the match, not looking to challenge the gym, unless the prize is too tempting or the opponent is too punchable. Shi Jian wordlessly curled the corners of his mouth. In the darkness, Toph seemed able to feel his slight emotional change and gave a couple of giggles. A strange sense of alliance from sharing a secret together quietly grew between the two. The tunnel wound downwards, and it felt like they had walked quite a long distance. Just as Shi Jian estimated they should have left the vicinity of the Panchi residence, the vague sounds of a noisy crowd and a dull, rhythmic vibration, like countless feet stomping the ground, came from ahead. The air also became warmer, mixed with the smell of sweat, dust, cheap alcohol, and an indescribable aura of excitement. We're here. Toph's voice rang with excitement. She stopped and felt around in front of her. After another slight sound of a mechanism, a stone slab was pushed open. Blindingly bright light and deafening clamor instantly flooded into the tunnel like a tide, drowning them. Shi Jian instinctively squinted his eyes, adjusting to the sudden light. The view before him suddenly opened up as a massive underground space, beyond imagination, presented itself. Earth Strength Hegemony Tournament. A huge slogan pieced together from rough rocks hung high from the ceiling of the cavern, illuminated fitfully by dozens of crude torches burning unknown fats. The space sank down in a bowl shape, with a circular stone platform dozens of yards in diameter at the center, the so-called arena. Surrounding the arena were rough stone steps rising level by level, and at this moment, they were densely packed with people. All sorts of people from all walks of life. Rugged miners, mercenaries with fierce gazes, scantily clad women, masked rangers, and even a few landlords and wealthy merchants dressed in silk but wearing expressions of fanaticism. Everyone was waving their arms, shouting, and roaring. The sound waves converged into a heart-pounding torrent of energy that hammered against Shi Jian's eardrums. The air was hot and stale, the scent of sweat mixed with dust hitting the nose directly. Shi Jian frowned slightly. This environment was completely different from the solemnity he usually inhabited, filled with primitive wildness and chaotic vitality. He looked at Toph, only to find that far from being uncomfortable, she took a deep breath with an almost entranced expression on her face. Her gray-green eyes were startlingly bright, like two stars that had fallen into the mortal world. AI model. Gemini 3.1 flashlight. How is it? Pretty intense, right? Toph shouted at the top of her lungs into Shi Jian's ear, just to be heard over the deafening roar. Shi Jian nodded, his gaze sweeping sharply across the arena. He noticed the simple railing around the edge of the ring, though it was clearly only symbolic. In certain areas of the spectator stands, there seemed to be people maintaining order, but they all wore uniform dark brown leather armor with a simple earth block emblem embroidered on their cuffs. They were likely from the organizers. What he paid more attention to were the presences hidden in the corners of the crowd, several quite formidable powers, scanning new faces with scrutinizing and wary gazes. The appearance of him and Toph had clearly attracted some attention from the shadows. Find a place to sit and watch. Toph pulled on Shi Jian's arm, maneuvering as nimbly as a fish through the crowded and foul-smelling throng. She seemed to have a destination in mind, weaving and winding, squeezing past a group of drunken toughs and several women screaming out bets, until they reached a spot that was relatively close to the front but not too conspicuous, in the shadow of a massive support pillar, where two protruding rocks just happened to serve as stools. No sooner had they sat down than a more intense burst of cheering and whistling erupted from the center of the ring. A sturdily built earthbender dressed in simple clothes jumped onto the ring. He used no amplification tools, yet his voice was incredibly resonant, instantly overpowering the noise of the entire arena. Everyone, quiet down. Let our ears take a break, and let your hearts prepare for an even more intense pounding in the next match. His voice was modulated and highly provocative. I am your favorite old friend, the one who ignites the rocks with his voice, Xin Fu. Xin Fu. Xin Fu. Xin Fu. The audience shouted his name fanatically. That's right. It's Xin Fu. Thank you all for visiting our Jailing Town's most hardcore, most explosive, and purest feast of power, the Earth Strength Hegemony Tournament. Here, only the hardest fists, the heaviest defenses, and the wildest Earth power can reign supreme. Tell me, tonight, what do you want to see? Blood. Power. Champion. Came the mountain shaking, sea roaring response. Very good. Excellent taste. Xin Fu laughed. But before that, let us bring up the first pair of warriors to warm us up tonight. From the Black Rock Mine, Rockbreaker, Brock. Versus, from the Southern Frontier Dunes, Shadow of Quicksand, Hassan. Following Xin Fu's passionate introduction, two large men of vastly different builds walked out from the tunnels on either side of the ring. One was as sturdy as a bear, with dark skin, knotted muscles, and holding two heavy short-handled pickaxes, Brock. The other was lean and agile, wrapped in a sand-yellow turban and robes, barefoot, and wearing peculiar fingerless gloves with membranes connecting the gaps between the fingers, Hassan. The two stared at each other fiercely, sparks seemingly flying in the air between them. The rules, old friends know them. Simple. Brutal. Effective. Xin Fu's voice resonated through the arena. No sharpened weapons. No attacking the back of the head or the groin. 10 counts on the ground and you lose. Or, voluntarily forfeit. Of course, I know that for the warriors here, the word, forfeit, is harder than making them eat dirt. So, enough talk. Let the rocks witness power. The first match of the Earth Strength Hegemony Tournament begins. As soon as Xin Fu finished speaking, accompanied by a crisp gong sound, the entire arena instantly erupted. Brock. Smash him flat. Hassan. Make him taste the quicksand. Bet. Place your bets. Shi Jian and Toph's gazes were immediately drawn to the ring. Brock let out a beastly roar, brandishing his pickaxes and charging at Hassan like a human tank. His heavy footsteps thudded against the stone platform, his momentum terrifying. Hassan, however, was exceptionally calm. The moment Brock charged close, his body twisted strangely, like a boneless snake, sliding away along the ground while simultaneously slamming his hands onto the floor. Quicksand trap. The hard rock beneath Hassan's feet instantly softened and flowed, turning into a patch of quicksand several feet in diameter. Brock couldn't stop his momentum, one foot plunged into it, and he instantly lost his balance. What exquisite earthbending! Shi Jian exclaimed in a low voice. This technique of instantly changing the form of rock required extremely delicate control over earth elements, completely different from the open and grand style of the Baifeng family lands. That's a southern style. Toph was also watching intently, her eyes flashing with excitement and contemplation. Look! Brock is in trouble. Brock roared, trying to pull his foot out of the quicksand while swinging his pickaxes at Hassan. Hassan, however, drifted around the edge of the quicksand like a ghost, his hands continuously slapping the ground, causing the area of quicksand beneath Brock to expand and deepen. Every time Brock struggled, he sank deeper, and the heavy pickaxes became a hindrance instead. Brock, use brute force to charge out. A spectator shouted anxiously. Brock seemed to realize that this wouldn't work, so he roared, his muscles bulging all over his body, and a yellow light flashed across his skin. He gave up on pulling his foot out and instead concentrated all his strength into his other leg, stomping fiercely onto the ground that hadn't yet turned to sand. Earth-splitting stomp. Boom. A muffled sound. With his foot as the center, the hard ground cracked like a spiderweb into several fissures, and a powerful shockwave spread along the ground, not only instantly dispersing the quicksand beneath his feet but also sending the caught-off-guard Hassan staggering backward. Beautiful. Shi Jian couldn't help but praise. This was a typical application of the Baifeng family or Panchi family style, using pure power and vibration to disrupt the opponent's control. Hassan was pushed back several steps, his expression changing slightly. Clearly, he hadn't expected the opponent's strength to be so fierce. Brock seized the opportunity, pulled out his deeply stuck foot, and roared as he charged again. This time, his pickaxes were condensed with a thick glow of earth elements, clearly intending to get serious. Interesting. Toph watched with great interest, her body leaning slightly forward. One focuses on power, the other on technique. Although Brock was caught, his foundation is solid, and Hassan's quicksand trap consumes a lot of energy, it's hard to say now. Sure enough, Hassan stopped trying to create large-scale quicksand and instead used agile footwork and smaller, more sudden localized liquefaction to interfere with Brock. Brock, relying on his thick skin and great strength, withstood Hassan's attacks head-on, each blow of his pickaxes carrying the momentum to split mountains and shatter stones, forcing Hassan into dangerous situations. The battle on the ring became increasingly intense, with the glow of earth elements constantly flashing and colliding. The audience's emotions were thoroughly ignited, with roars, curses, and cheers rising one after another, merging into a fanatical ocean. Xin Fu jumped around the edge of the ring, using his highly provocative language to keep adding fuel to the fire, pushing the atmosphere to wave after wave of climaxes. Shi Jian and Toph were both watching with great absorption. As a Panchi young master, Shi Jian had dabbled in various fighting styles of the Earth sect, but this was his first time observing such an underground black market-style fight from such close range and so unreservedly. He carefully observed both sides' methods of using earth elements, the rhythm of their power bursts, their defensive techniques, and some underhanded but not against the rules tricks such as pretending to trip to lure the opponent closer, silently analyzing the pros and cons and what could be learned. Toph, on the other hand, watched in a more wild manner. Her small fists clenched from time to time, her body making subtle dodging or exertion movements with the offense and defense on the field, muttering to herself, "That move has a tricky angle. Oh, so stupid, at this time you should use a side slide step followed by an earth spike. This move to dissipate force is interesting, like a loach." She was completely immersed in the appreciation and analysis of the combat techniques, her gray eyes shining amazingly bright. The first match ended quite tragically. Brock finally broke through Hassan's sand shield with a powerful rockslide strike, slamming him heavily to the ground. Hassan struggled a few times but couldn't get up and was declared the loser. Brock also paid a price, with multiple cuts from the quicksand all over his body, panting, but he won the applause of the whole house. Following that were the second match, the third match. Xin Fu's hosting skills were masterful, always able to render every battle thrilling. The contestants who took the stage had varied styles. Some were purely power types like Brock, some were tricky technical types like Hassan, some were locusts, who excelled at throwing stones from a distance, some were iron walls, specializing in defense as hard as a turtle shell, and there was even an earth skin man, who could temporarily petrify his own skin. Shi Jian and Toph watched with fascination, completely forgetting the time. They exchanged views in low voices. Shi Jian's steady analysis often hit the mark, while Toph always managed to come up with some wild yet highly practical ideas, and the two were unexpectedly in sync in their discussions on combat techniques. In this environment filled with the collision of raw power and technique, the subtle barrier of being fiancés between them seemed to vanish temporarily, replaced by a tacit understanding as fellow martial artists exploring together. Next match. The main event is coming, folks. Xin Fu's voice suddenly rose, filled with unprecedented excitement. Let us use our wildest roars to welcome tonight's final challenger. From the mysterious southern swamp, known as Theoswamp Monster, Grum. Versus our three-match winner, the Panchi Bulwark, Toshin. With Xin Fu's roar, an extremely tall figure walked out from the tunnel. This person was a full 9 feet tall, with a shockingly massive build, muscles knotted like blocks of granite, and skin that was an unhealthy grayish-green, seemingly covered in slippery mud. His face was rugged and ugly, with fangs protruding, and a pair of small eyes flickering with a cruel and stupid light. He had no weapons, but those fan-like hands, with black and sharp nails, were chilling to behold. It was none other than the swamp monster, Grum. And his opponent, Toshin, was a typical Panchi clan tough guy, 8 feet tall, sturdy build, with healthy bronze skin and a resolute face. He was shirtless, wearing only leather pants, revealing muscles covered in scars but cast like steel. He walked steadily onto the ring, every step carrying the heaviness of a great rock, his eyes sharp and calm, forming a stark contrast to Grum's ferocity. Toshin. 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 The home field advantage was obvious, most of the audience was cheering for Toshin. Grum seemed to be enraged by the sound, he slammed his thick chest, producing a dull, drum-like roar, opened his blood-red mouth, and let out a deafening roar toward the audience, spraying foul-smelling saliva. A nauseating stench, mixed with the smell of rotting silt and wild beasts, permeated the air, causing the nearby spectators to cover their noses and back away. So stinky. Toph also wrinkled her nose in disgust, subconsciously leaning toward Shi Jian, as if wanting to get away from the source of the stench. Shi Jian also frowned slightly. Grum's presence was not only powerful but also carried an unsettling sense of filth. He concentrated and prepared. Such opponents were often immensely strong and knew no pain, making them very dangerous. The battle erupted instantly at Xin Fu's roar. Grum was indeed like a human beast, pouncing on Toshin without any method, his huge palms swatting down with a whistling wind, a force enough to smash a bull's head. Toshin didn't meet it head-on. He sidestepped steadily, while his right fist condensed a thick yellow light, like a cannonball fired from its chamber, smashing fiercely into Grum's ribs. Bang! A muffled sound, like hitting tough leather. Grum's massive body only swayed, letting out an angry roar, seemingly not heavily damaged. His grayish-green skin seemed to have incredible toughness. Toshin missed his strike and immediately changed moves, ducking to avoid the huge arm Grum swept over, while simultaneously performing a sweeping kick with the heavy power of Earth Element enhancement, smashing fiercely into Grum's supporting leg. Crack! A clear sound of breaking bone. Grum wailed and fell to one knee. Good. The audience erupted in earth-shaking cheers. However, just as Toshin was preparing to press his advantage and deliver a decisive blow to Grum, a sudden change occurred. A cunning, vicious light flashed in the eyes of the kneeling Grum, and his injured leg suddenly exploded. No, not exploded, but from his knee wound, a large amount of viscous, pitch-black, strongly foul-smelling mud gushed out. This mud, as if it had a life of its own, instantly covered Grum's injured leg and spread rapidly, forming a huge leg, made of filthy mud. Even more terrifyingly, this mud leg had terrifying corrosiveness. Upon touching the ring floor, it actually made a hissing sound and emitted wisps of white smoke. What the hell is that? Toshin's expression changed drastically, and he hurriedly retreated. Roar. Grum let out a triumphant roar, and that huge mud leg suddenly raised, carrying the momentum of 10,000 tons and a pungent stench, like a huge battering ram, smashing fiercely toward Toshin. The speed was more than twice as fast as before. Toshin had nowhere to dodge, so he could only cross his arms in front of his chest, his whole body erupting with a brilliant yellow light, condensing into a thick rock shield. Boom! The huge mud leg smashed fiercely onto the rock shield. The terrifying impact sounded like a thunderclap. The entire ring vibrated violently. The rock shield was instantly covered in spiderweb-like cracks, and the ground beneath Toshin's feet cracked inch by inch. His whole body was smashed by the immense force, his feet sinking deep into the stone platform, his face instantly flushed, and a trace of blood spilled from the corner of his mouth. The corrosiveness of the filthy mud was madly eroding the rock shield, making a teeth-aching, hissing sound. My God! The audience was stunned by this terrifying scene. Not good. Toshin is in danger. Shi Jian's eyes narrowed, his body subconsciously tensing up. He could feel that Toshin was under immense pressure. That mud not only had huge power but also carried filthy energy that was eroding his defense and stamina. Toph was also watching with full attention, her small face tense. That mud is weird. It's not pure earth element. It's like it's mixed with some kind of filthy life force. Just when everyone thought Toshin was about to be unable to hold on, another unexpected change occurred. Grum, seeing that his single strike failed to completely crush Toshin, roared in rage and raised his giant mud leg again, preparing to launch an even more violent attack. However, he seemed to have imperfect control over this newly acquired power. As the giant leg made of filthy mud gathered strength, the energy inside it suddenly began to churn violently and uncontrollably. PFF'd. A sickening, muffled sound. At the knee joint of Grum's giant mud leg, the internal energy expanded rapidly and uncontrollably, causing it to burst apart. A massive glob of viscous, pitch-black mud, emitting a strong, foul stench and highly corrosive properties, shot out from Grum's body like a high-pressure water jet, hurtling in a fan shape toward the audience. It was fast as lightning. The target was aimed directly at the area where Shi Jian and Toph were located. Look out! Shi Jian's pupils constricted. The spray of filthy mud covered a huge range, moved extremely fast, and carried a potent corrosive aura. In such a crowded environment, dodging it completely was almost impossible. He reacted instantly, not by dodging backward, there were people behind him too, but by lunging forward, while his right hand shot out like lightning, forcibly pulling Toph toward his chest. This action was purely a protective reaction born from combat instinct. Toph had been focused intently on the strange turn of events on the ring, and caught off guard, she was yanked over by a powerful force. She gasped in surprise, completely losing her balance, and slammed firmly into Shi Jian's arms. At the same time, Shi Jian's left arm shot up, instantly covered in a layer of thick, dense, metallic gleaming Panchi armor. He didn't hesitate to block in front of himself with his armor-clad left arm, while leaning his body slightly forward, shielding Toph tightly within the corner formed by his body and a support pillar. SSSS's. Most of the foul-smelling, filthy mud was blocked by Shi Jian's incredibly sturdy Panchi armor. The pitch-black mud struck the hard Panchi, emitting a harsh, corrosive sound and releasing clouds of white smoke. The powerful impact made Shi Jian's body sway slightly, but his feet remained rooted to the ground, unmoving. However, the spray was too wide, and the angle was too tricky. Even though Shi Jian blocked the frontal impact, a small stream of mud like a disgusting slug splashed through the gap at the edge of the Panchi armor, shooting straight toward the cheek of Toph, who was shielded in his arms. Shi Jian's heart tightened. At this moment, his right hand was holding Toph's waist, having pulled her over, and his left arm was blocking in front. He had no time to parry again. At the critical moment, Toph's reaction was lightning fast. The moment Shi Jian pulled her into his arms, although she was off balance, her martial artist instincts had already kicked in. When that bit of disgusting mud splashed toward her, she didn't even look up. Relying on her keen sense of danger and earth-sect instincts, she tilted her small face to the side while her right hand shot out like lightning. She didn't use any earth-sect techniques, it was purely a lightning-fast, precise movement. Snap. An extremely faint sound. Toph's two fingers, her index and middle fingers, had precisely pinched that droplet of splashing, highly corrosive, filthy mud. The movement was light and swift, like picking a flower. The droplet trembled slightly at her fingertips, less than an inch from her cheek. Time seemed to freeze at this moment. Shi Jian could clearly feel the warm, soft body in his arms, the body heat coming through the thin clothing, and the faint, fresh scent on her like grass after rain, a stark contrast to the surrounding stench. His chin was almost resting on the top of her head, and the stray hairs of her ponytail brushed against his neck, bringing a slight tickle. His right hand was still tightly wrapped around her waist, and he could feel the amazing strength contained within that slender waist. His left arm, still covered in the hard Panchi armor, blocked in front of her like a silent guardian. Toph was completely immersed in Shi Jian's broad and solid embrace. Her cheek was pressed against his sturdy chest, and through the fabric, she could feel his steady, powerful heartbeat, thump, 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 beating against her eardrums, clearer than any sound of impact on the ring. Her nose was filled with his unique, clean scent, like sunlight on rocks, mixed with a hint of sweat. It wasn't unpleasant, instead, it brought a strange sense of security. Her right hand was still raised, two fingers pinching that disgusting drop of mud, a somewhat comical pose. She could feel his arm wrapped around her waist, warm and powerful. Both of them were stunned. Shi Jian looked down and happened to meet Toph's upturned face. Those gray eyes, usually full of cunning, wildness, or disdain, were now rarely clouded with a layer of mist due to the close contact and the recent thrill, carrying a hint of bewilderment and shyness. Her cheeks were visibly flushing, rapidly dyeing a charming rosy hue from their pale state, spreading all the way to her small earlobes. In the dim firelight, it was breathtakingly beautiful. Shi Jian's heart skipped a beat, uncontrollably and violently. A strange, unprecedented feeling of palpitation swept over him instantly. He felt his own cheeks starting to burn, and his ears were incredibly hot. He had never observed her so closely and clearly before. So her eyelashes were this long, her nose so small and petite, and her lips a pale pink, slightly parted now in surprise. The surrounding noise, the audience's gasps, Xin Fu's yelling, Grum's roars, Tashan's shouts, seemed to instantly fade away, isolated by an invisible barrier. The whole world was left with only each other's violent heartbeats, intertwined breathing, and their own clear reflections in the other's eyes. You. Toph opened her mouth, her voice carrying a tremor and huskiness she hadn't even noticed herself. She wanted to say something, but didn't know what to say. Her fingers pinching the mud moved slightly, and the drop of mud fell onto the stone floor, making a hiss sound and corroding a small pit. This faint sound was like a switch, instantly breaking the invisible, ambiguous barrier between them. Shi Jian abruptly released his hand from Toph's waist, his movement so fast it was almost flustered, as if it were a hot potato. The Panchi armor covering his left arm also instantly dissipated, revealing his unscathed arm. He quickly stepped back, putting distance between them, his movement stiff and unnatural. He didn't dare look at Toph's eyes again, his gaze darting flusteredly toward the ring, trying to hide his own burning cheeks and ears. Ahem, are you okay? Shi Jian cleared his throat, his voice sounding much deeper and huskier than usual. Toph also seemed to wake from a dream, quickly lowering her head to hide her crimson cheeks. She flicked her fingers that had pinched the mud, as if something still remained on them, then wiped them haphazardly on her clothes. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, so fast it made it hard for her to breathe. I'm fine. Toph's voice was also unsteady, carrying a hint of forced composure, but the end of her sentence rose slightly. Piece of cake. Something like this. HMPH. She forced herself to lift her head and look at the ring, trying to pull her attention back, but the corner of her eye couldn't help but glance at the tall figure beside her. His profile was exceptionally clear in the flickering firelight, his jawline tight, and the suspicious blush on his ears didn't seem to have fully faded. This discovery made Toph feel her cheeks burning even more. On the ring, taking advantage of the moment Grum was temporarily out of control due to his exploding mud leg, Toshin erupted with astonishing power. A mountain-crushing fist, concentrating all his strength, slammed fiercely into Grum's chest. Grum's massive body, as if struck by a battering ram, flew backward and crashed heavily against the edge of the ring. Filthy mud splattered everywhere, and after struggling a few times, he stopped moving completely. Toshin was also exhausted, kneeling on one knee, gasping violently. Xin Fu exaggeratedly announced Toshin's victory, and the audience erupted in cheers of relief, but Shi Jian and Toph were somewhat distracted. That lightning-fast embrace, the distance where they could smell each other's breath, their violent heartbeats and burning cheeks. The feeling was too clear, too unexpected, and too intimate. An unprecedented, indescribable awkwardness and subtle palpitation quietly entwined in their hearts like vines, refusing to go away. Although the subsequent matches remained exciting, with even stronger contestants competing for the ink jade marrow that emitted a warm, gentle luster as the prize, both Shi Jian and Toph were somewhat disinterested. They still sat side by side, but there seemed to be an invisible, subtle distance between their bodies. Their communication also dwindled, and occasionally saying a word or two about the match in low voices, their tone seemed a bit dry. Finally, when the last match ended and the ink jade marrow was won by a taciturn, tall, thin person skilled at manipulating sharp stone stalagmites, Xin Fu announced the end of tonight's Earth Strength Hegemony tournament. The crowd began to leave noisily. Shi Jian and Toph mixed into the crowd, silently walking back along the passage they had come. The tunnel was still dark, but the atmosphere was completely different from when they arrived. The ease, curiosity, and tacit understanding of their shared adventure had disappeared, replaced by a suffocating silence and pervasive awkwardness. In the darkness, their breathing sounds were exceptionally clear. Shi Jian could feel Toph was not far behind him, her footsteps seeming a bit chaotic. He wanted to say something to break the silence, but found his throat dry and his mind blank. The sensation of holding her, the fresh scent of her hair, the charming flush when she looked up, these images flashed repeatedly in his mind uncontrollably. Toph was equally flustered. She clutched her clothes tightly, as if the temperature and strength of his arm when he pulled her over still remained on her fingers. And the feel of his chest, the sound of his heartbeat. Bastard Shi Jian, who told you to hold me? She cursed fiercely in her heart, but her cheeks burned uncontrollably again. What annoyed her even more was that she hadn't pushed him away immediately at the time, but instead, seemed to have been stunned for a moment. The tunnel seemed to have become exceptionally long. Finally, touching the mechanism again and pushing open the giant boulder, the cool night breeze mixed with the scent of garden plants rushed toward them, refreshing both of them. Returning to the back garden of the Panchi residence, the moonlight was brighter than when they arrived, and the clouds had dispersed quite a bit. The two stood in the shadow of the rockery, speechless for a moment. Ahem. Shi Jian spoke first, his voice restoring its usual steadiness, but if one listened carefully, a trace of imperceptible tension could still be detected. Tonight was an eye-opener. Yeah. Toph lowered her head, grinding a small stone on the ground with her toe, her voice muffled. It was all right. That ink jade marrow, what a pity. She tried to steer the topic back to the match. Yeah. Shi Jian responded, but his gaze involuntarily fell on her lowered, flushed profile. He paused, and inexplicably added, your reaction was fast. Toph's body stiffened slightly, and she lifted her head abruptly, her gray eyes shining amazingly in the moonlight, carrying a hint of shy annoyance. Duh. This young lady is. Before she could finish, she met Shi Jian's gaze. His gaze was deep, seeming to still retain a trace of complex emotions that hadn't dissipated, no longer the pure calmness or helplessness of usual. Toph's heart skipped a beat again, and the rest of her words choked in her throat. The atmosphere grew subtle once more. That, mud. Shi Jian moved his gaze away, stiffly changing the subject. It didn't get your clothes dirty, right? He recalled her agile movement of pinching that drop of mud at the end. No. I wiped it off. Toph immediately denied, her voice raising a bit unconsciously, as if covering up something. Another silence followed. The night breeze blew through the leaves, rustling. It's getting late. Shi Jian looked at the sky. Time to go back. Be careful, don't get caught. I know. Toph replied, her tone recovering a bit of her usual liveliness, but if one listened carefully, there was still a lack of confidence. She turned to leave, took 2 steps, then stopped, not turning back, her voice coming low. Hey. Shi Jian looked at her slender back. Yeah. Just now, thanks. Toph's voice was as soft as a mosquito, speaking at lightning speed. Before Shi Jian could react, she immediately, like a startled rabbit, tapped her toes and her figure disappeared lightly into the shaded path of the garden, so fast it was as if she were fleeing. Shi Jian stood in place, looking at the direction Toph disappeared, the night breeze blowing against his slightly burning cheeks. That, thanks, soft as a mosquito, lingered in his ears. He raised his right hand, the place where he had held her waist just now, seeming to still retain that slender and powerful touch. He slowly clenched his fist, then slowly relaxed it, complex emotions that he himself hadn't fully understood surging in his deep eyes. After a long while, he turned around and silently headed toward his courtyard. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is coming soon.
Thanks for watching my video. Please like and share it.